My Family Thinks I'm Crazy, a podcast where I, your host, try to give you some tips on how you can explain all this weird, wild, crazy conspiracy stuff to the people you love most. Because that's what I've been trying to do for the past 10 years with no success.
I've been telling everybody that our government is shady, but every time I do, my family thinks I'm crazy. The hollow earth, UFOs, aliens invading, fluoride in the water, they swear skies daily. When I talk about these things, they think I'm crazy. There's no escaping anymore the evil that we're facing. Illuminati mind control, they're sacrificing babies. The end of days, but anyways, my family thinks I'm crazy.
What, they don't want to listen to you?
No, they don't want to listen. They don't want to hear it. They're just like, oh, here we go, Mark. Off again with your...
Mark being Mark again.
Yeah. So, that's the thing about podcasts is when you're on the air, and it's like therapy, If I can't talk to my family about this stuff, I'll talk to you, Matt, and all our listeners.
You'll just start your whole podcast.
Yeah. So who are we talking about today, Matt?
They think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. They really think that I'm crazy. My family thinks that I'm crazy.
Bring healing to the people that are in that area.
Right.
Whether they consume the water itself or they're in that general area with that cymatic frequency being played, they may have been a healing center as well. And one of the things you find with the star forts is, you'll see the pattern above ground, but what most people don't understand is that more than 50% of the star fort is usually subterranean. If you look at a city, an overview of a city these days, it looks an awful lot like a motherboard to a computer. Although it may not be the same way it was before, I think functionally the architecture still acts in the same manner. It still has that property where it needs, obviously needs the human in it too now for the battery. I think there is something to that. There is some energetic basis to the way that cities are laid out. And even to this day, I think it's still, they have some sort of function with the way energy is harnessed or drawn or used in those city areas based on the landscape. That's the $1 million question. Why isn't it in the history books? And why do we have CIA documents saying that there was an effort to erase Tartaria from the history books? I mean, that's in writing in CIA documents. So there is, again, if we want to get back to the term conspiracy, there is a conspiracy right there.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I'm your host, Mark Palmer, and on today's show, we have the man behind the Great Deception podcast. And I gotta say, if you're not following Matt on Instagram already, please go ahead and do yourself a favor and do that right now. The guy is constantly posting very, very informational stuff. I mean, pictures, descriptions. I can't compete. It's awesome. I learn a lot of stuff from Matt weekly, from the cool stuff he's posting on his Instagram and his podcast, the Great Deception podcast. You ought to check that out too. And of course, today's conversation was great. We got into the World's Fair. We talked a little bit about the origins of man and civilization and all the stuff you've come to know and expect here on the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And not just that, we talked about star forts, so much more. Great conversation with Matt. Please go subscribe and show him love at the Great Deception podcast. And if you're loving the show, we got a Patreon. Show us some love there and figure out all the ways to support the show at myfamilythinksimcrazy.com. Thank you so much to everybody who's with me in 2022. A lot of love from me to you and everyone who's a part of Alt Media United. Thank you so much for being here and enjoy this conversation with Matt. Oh, and stick around for the extended outro with my buddy Ron from New England, host of the Wicked Planet podcast. There's tons of ways to support the show. We have a new t-shirt shop and I am working on a bunch of different designs. There's a couple cool ones on there. There's a couple not so cool ones that I'll admit I made that I threw up there. If you're interested, check them out. There's a lot of potential with our merch store. I'll say that. So go there, check it out. Let me know what you think. And if you're an artist yourself, feel free to come forward. I'd love to hear some ideas for possible shirts for the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I definitely have been in touch with a couple of really cool artists lately, so we'll see what happens. But feel free, the doors are still open. Hit me up if you're interested in possibly making some art for the show. I'd be, obviously happy to pay you for your services. And if you're willing to do it for free, possibly as a way to support the show, that would be really, really awesome. And we'd be sure to give you a shout out and recommend you to friends, because I know I'm not the only podcaster who's in need of this kind of thing. So thank you so much to all our supporters. If you like that kind of stuff, we also have some artwork for sale, some jewelry that I made myself, some paintings that my girlfriend Tara painted herself. So go over to our website, myfamilythinksimcrazy.com, to check out all the ways to support the show and stay in touch. We also have some really awesome supporters, some sponsors. Shout out to all the folks supporting us on Patreon. And most importantly, shout out to our sponsors, Audrey Lobdell. Hit her up for all your Reiki and tuning fork needs. We also have our friends at Akasha Goods for some holistic healing resources. You can get candles, you can get essential oils. Speaking of essential oils, one of our patrons and friends, One Thumb L, has some really awesome crystal infused essential oils. And then finally, Fru, the forest bathing service. If you're interested in checking out how to bathe in the forest, hit up Fru. All of these links are in the description. Shout out to our friend Yogi Zorananda. I listened to his recent, maybe not so recent conversation on the Grimerica show Outlawed. Very cool stuff. Shout out to the Yogi. Go support his podcast, Renegade Yogi Podcast Experience. The link is also in the description. All of that is there. And of course, much love to Matt for joining me on today's episode. Follow him at the Great Deception Podcast. And finally, Ron from New England with the Wicked Planet Podcast. So much to do, but I'm sure you got time to listen to these awesome podcasts, as well as recommend mine to a friend. That's right, the show is growing, so recommend the show to a friend. The best way to do that is Instagram. Follow us on Instagram and share the show with your friends. If you share us in your story, I'll shout you out on the show. So thank you so much, folks, for listening to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast, and enjoy this conversation with Matt and Ron from New England. Separately, of course, but Matt first, then Ron. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. I'm your host, Mark, and with me today is a gentleman who I know in an odd way. I remember the first time he got in contact with me, it was through an Instagram message, and he said, "Hey, man, I know your cousin." I'm like, well, that's odd because, she's, 15-something years older than me, so this must have happened when I was really young. And as a matter of fact, this guy knew me slightly in some respect when I was young, and he signed up for the Patreon. And I don't know if you had a podcast back then, but since you started your own podcast, which is really fucking cool, your podcast is hitting the charts. The Great Deception podcast's off and running. I think you got close to 20 episodes now. So if you haven't heard today's guest, please go over in the episode description, subscribe to his podcast, follow him, check out his work. Matt, how are you, brother?
Great, Mark. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, and
it's funny how it's a small world, because I heard you on Sam's podcast when you were doing the Aleister Crowley episode, and I heard your name, and I'm like, man, there cannot be that many Mark Steves out there. And so I reached out to you, and I was like, man, it's such a small world.
It's so synchronous. And I remember being, that was so fresh. And I'd never come close to anything like that in my life, going on Tinfoil Hat, and all of a sudden 100,000 people hear my voice and hear me talking about a subject that I'm not even really that attached to. Like, I like Aleister Crowley's work, but I'm not going to go and write a book about him. But at the same time, it really didn't feel like anybody had given him a proper shake on that show. So I went out and did that. And, I got a lot of messages from that show, which is why I was a little apprehensive to all of them. But your message kind of broke through because it was one of the few from someone who I had actually already met, a long time ago. Maybe I didn't quite remember you, but yeah, it's so cool, man, the way things synchronistically work themselves out. But we've talked about that before. I think it's another indication that I'm on the right track, you're on the right track, that these little syncs happen, and in hindsight too, but what, I guess I want to take it back to that point. Like, would my family think you're crazy back then? Like, were you into conspiracy theories and all this stuff back then, or is this relatively new for you? Like, how long have you been into this stuff, Matt?
No, I wasn't back then. I mean, this was high school, so we're going back 25 years now. So right. I wasn't really into conspiracy theories. I was always into history, though. In high school, I took all my alternate classes were history classes. I was always fascinated by history and the different stories. And, I could never really understand why we always only got the Western side of history. And that always kind of sat with me wrong. So when I went to college, I dug into it a little bit more. And in there, you get into a whole different element. Now you're dealing with, education system and the indoctrination. And, I headbutted with a few professors because I started researching things that didn't add up. And so it was probably in like the early 2000s that I started really realizing that something wasn't right. Then 9/11 happens, and I was like everybody else, at the time for the most part, and I was all red, white, and blue, let's make these people pay for whoever did this. And then all of a sudden someone showed me loose change. And things really changed from there, where I started seeing connections being made of things that weren't being told in the public, but were obviously taking place behind the scenes. And so from there, basically, it's been a slow journey here and there. I got big into Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson and their old studies of the historical timeline, which led me into guys like Matthew LaCroix and his great work on the timeline. And so when I started realizing that, that's when things started really clicking for me that, hey man, if we don't even know what the timeline is, and we're being told that it's one thing when there's evidence that it's totally different, what else are they lying about? Right. And then, that's when the floodgates open. When that happens, things get really, and then the final straw was in 2016. I came down with an autoimmune issue and got into the medical system. And, I get into it, and my first meeting with my doctor was one of those where we sit down and he's like, okay, what's bothering you? And I just tell him, and then he writes me a prescription. And he says, come back in about a month and we'll see how this is going. No mention of anything that would really help me, like lifestyle, diet, and things like that I had been kind of researched to try and help the condition and see if there were ways outside of the medical system. And I got bogged down into pharmaceuticals for about 2 years. My condition worsened. I was having, suicidal thoughts at times. I was having, nightmares that were unmatched, I bloody, gory nightmares. And so I just cold turkey cut off the pharmaceuticals and started going into alternative methods of healing and things like that. And that's when I realized that, if the medical system isn't meant to heal us, then this whole system is broken. Because what I found was that when I would bring ideas to my doctor about things that might work that weren't, part of the pharmaceutical industry, they were shot down immediately and kind of poo-pooed. And that's when, and then, so I started trying some of it and it started working. And I exit stage right. I'm done with the medical system. I got out, and that's where I started diving into all the other connections, political connections, money ties, pharmaceuticals, and then it gets into the history. And it got really interesting probably about 2 years ago when I first heard of Tartaria and Old World and started really going backwards. And I got introduced to that by Howdy McCoskey and his book, Exposing the Expositions. And because I had never heard of it, I heard him on a podcast. And so I bought his book and I started reading through it. And man, I don't know what it was, but it was like all these bells started going off, because this was something that just caught my attention. And since then, I've been, diving deep into that and many other subjects. But I really, right now, I'm interested in kind of the timeline of and how we got where we are now, because obviously there's been some major shifts and major, almost you could call them resets over time. And we, I don't know how many, I don't know when they happened, but that's kind of what I'm looking into right now. And when you start digging into that, it ties in with so many other things. You start getting into secret societies, and you start getting into, behind the scenes governments and things that are going on, and these different groups. And man, it's a wild world out there. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm glad we're just starting here, because we're going to get into this wild world. And you mentioned Howdy McCoskey. He is definitely someone I'm hoping to have on the show. I think we just emailed back and forth, so fingers crossed that'll happen soon. But Howdy, really fascinating character, had a really interesting near-death experience, and that kind of sent him into opening his eyes to this other world that's out there. I mean, very similar to your story on a minute level with the pharmaceuticals. You're having these nightmares. I mean, that sounds just scary, man. I do not want to, I'm lucky that a lot of my dreams are in a fog from all the pot I smoke, because, with the subject matter I research, I might have some pretty bad nightmares. I don't want to know. But yeah, I mean, I just took this stuff today, a homeopathic medicine. I had the ugliest, most awful pimple on my lip, man. And it was like the size of a ladybug. And for the past 3 podcasts, I was podcasting like this so nobody would see it. And I took this stuff from Whole Foods, and the thing like turned into a rock and fell off my lip. I mean, I've never seen medicine this fast acting. And I looked up, what I had bought, because, they had the Latinized name. It was like Sulfurious calcarea. And I looked that up, and it's gypsum. And I literally took a mineral, gypsum, and whatever my body did, it was like filling that, pimple up with gypsum until it turned into this solid, calcified thing that just fell right off. And I was like, wow, where was this when I was in high school? Because I had a lot of acne in high school that I wish I would have taken care of if I didn't go to the freaking doctor's office. I remember they took me to the dermatologist. That's where they took me. And they gave me the Proactive, prescription. And it only made my skin 10 times more irritated. So I had a very similar
and all that
stuff.
Yeah.
I had a very similar disillusionment. And cannabis was a huge, I think, stress reliever in my life at that point in time, which contributed to my skin clearing. And eventually now that's not an issue up until that one little lip blemish there. But yeah, I was so fascinated how quick the gypsum worked. I'm like, wow, this is unprecedented. And it goes to show, because gypsum, I think, it's a type of selenite, or selenite is a type of gypsum, either way. And the other, form of selenite that we can take into our body is selenium, which is a foundational mineral, and it seems like more and more they're pushing us out of a symbiotic relationship with our environment. And if we had one, we would have minerals, we would have plants, we would have animal fats, we would have all of these things in a balance contributing to our health. I mean, I don't know if this is your forte, but are you a conscious eater? Do you go out of your way to eat healthy now that you've realized, what the pharmaceutical industry really has in store?
Yeah, it definitely changed the way I looked at it. I mean, I was a food pyramid guy. You know, I trusted the old food pyramid up until this point, and then I realized, man, it's inverted. They did everything backwards. All the stuff that they push to you is what's going to cause you to be sick. So yeah, no, I have definitely been much more conscious of my diet, of what I intake. You know, I cut out soda, any of the sugary drinks, you know, immediately when I found this out, because, you know, one of the things I didn't realize, and, you know, obviously it's stupid on my part, was how inflammatory sugar is, and how sugar is in just about everything. And especially nowadays when they use the high fructose corn syrup, which is just terrible for your body. I mean, between that and all the different oils that they use, between soy and canola and things like that, that are just, they're wreaking havoc on your body and slowly breaking down your body. And what they don't tell you is what you should do, right? I mean, if we look at this pandemic, out of all the information we've gotten out of this, I don't think I've ever heard one person preach, you know, healthy living, get out in the sun, get your vitamins, you know, drink purified water, all this stuff. It's just, nope, go get a shot. Go get, you know, go get the quick fix from Daddy Pharmacy. And that's very disturbing, because there's many people that have bought into it, and many people that will suffer the consequences of it unknowingly, because they blindly trust authority. And that's a very slippery slope these days, because those who we are supposed to trust do not always have our best interests in mind.
Right. And to your point about, you know, history, going back and finding, you know, where this started, I think diet and food, we really could use some of that research in that area, because, you know, bread, for example, seems to be sort of an invention of this empire that, you know, I think we'll get into here. But, you know, with this timeline that we're given for human history, you know, 200,000 BC, that's 200,000 before the 2,000 year mark that they started us off at, you know, 2,000 or so years ago. If that's not confusing enough, folks, we'll try to just, you know, take the math work out of there and say 200 and 2,000 years ago, the theory is that Homo sapiens were appearing in Africa. So there was all these different types of hominids, and they would crossbreed and whatnot, and Homo sapiens began to reign supreme around this time. But when we re-examine, you know, you mentioned Graham Hancock, Randall Carlson, when we re-examine our own geological records, and we find that there are these reset events like the Younger Dryas period, that really, you know, it doesn't quite add up that, you know, this timeline we're given of human history, you know, it seems very linear, but I think in reality it was much more broken up than we're told. You know, we're given this false idea of progress. Like, we started here as cavemen, and then we slowly made our way up to Babylon, then to Egypt, then to Rome, then it all fell, then we rebuilt it again. And it just feels like that's just too convenient of a narrative.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. It seems like they just, there was a story, and then they just pressed replay on it. And stuck it into a certain period of time. And one of the things that I've, you know, I haven't dug deep into it yet, but some of the work of Anatoly Fomenko,
right,
and some of the things that he says, and he's a mathematician, so he's not coming at this, you know, as a historian trying to disprove his history. He's coming at this from a statistical standpoint and looking at the numbers. And one of the patterns that he sees, especially in the Roman Empire, is them recycling characters and eras and just giving them a different name. I mean, he goes to the extent to map out, I believe it's almost 30 rulers in a row. And he maps them out in the early 1st century. And then they tie out into I believe it's the 5th century Roman rulers, where, say, in year 1 through 14, Claudius was ruling. Well, if you go to the year 400 on that side, they would have Claudio, who was ruling for 14 years. Then you go down to the next ruler, and in the first century, if there was a triumvirate, well, in the 5th century, there just so happened to be a triumvirate also. That all of the duration of their reign is very similar. The names are eerily similar, if not the same in some instances. And like I said, in the number of rulers. So, Rome is known for having these triumvirates where they had 3 rulers at a time. And this would be shown in 2 different eras. And he says from a statistical standpoint, it's not possible for this to happen. But that's the story that we're told from the Roman standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like there's a sort of like a copy pasting that goes on. Like they, a couple hundred years goes by and they copy paste it to fill in that blank spot. Or, more wild speculation that came to mind as you were laying that out is, what if the occultists are right? There's some secret of immortality that these elites, these royals have, and they actually are living longer lifespans than we're traditionally led to believe. So they obfuscate it with these records and say, oh no, that's the son of Octavius. That's not Octavius. Meanwhile, this guy could have, lived behind closed doors for a couple hundred years. Extremely speculative, but this is the nature of history. We really can't do anything but speculate based on the evidence that's left behind, and stone structures seem to be some of the most permanent evidence that can be left behind, which is why the whole Tartaria subject is extremely fascinating to me, because why would, in theory, the conquerors want to, let's say you're conquering a foreign nation, right? You've just traveled hundreds, maybe thousands of miles to go to this foreign land. You win this battle. Half of your army is conceivably, they perished in the battle. And then you go and you destroy everything. If you want to take over this foreign country, why would you destroy things? Why wouldn't you just take them over? Why wouldn't you just, repurpose what's already there? It just seems like an incredible waste of time and energy to destroy a whole city and then, rebuild it. It seems more likely that these, what we're calling, Tartarian possibly buildings, were repurposed. They were taken from the predecessor, the losing party in whatever war that's been rewritten out of our history, and replaced, right? I think that's the case with a lot of these Tartarian structures, because as we're putting it, this type of stuff lasts much longer than anything else on the planet. Stone.
Yeah, and we see it a lot with cathedrals as well. That's one of the ones where it seems like that any large scale building, was automatically deemed a cathedral. And when you start looking at these, especially the structural layout of these buildings, they're not just brick and mortar buildings. These were intricately designed. They were designed using, the golden ratio. You see a lot of the flower of life in these buildings. You see lots of geometric shapes and patterns that, they're not, it's not just typical masonry that we're seeing here in these buildings. And especially for the time, like you're saying, if you're going to come in and take over a nation or a country, why would you go in, take them over, destroy all the infrastructure, and then have to rebuild it in a time when supposedly, materials aren't at your beck and call? You have to produce all of this stuff. And we're talking about a time pre-power, right. We're told there's no power tools. There's no tools. We're talking horse and carriage. We're talking,
ox and cart
levies. Yeah, levies and pulleys. And you look, just looking at stones like Göbekli Tepe, that doesn't make any sense. How are you moving stones like that? And how are they building these buildings? And some of them are in places that seem very uninhabitable.
Right.
We're talking mountaintops and cliffs and things like that. And again, at a time when the technology wasn't there to make it easy. So it's almost as if they had abundant resources, infinite resources at the time to be able to create these buildings. And then the next layer comes in, and they want to just destroy. And it raises a lot of questions, along the lines of, were these buildings some sort of structure, earth structure, right? Some part of some larger energy grid that ties in with things like ley lines and other points on the earth that have energetic powers. And that's what fascinates me the most about this. And as we look at it over and over, one of the things that you see, at least in modern history, is that war is basically, not centered around, but one of the main things that you see coming out of all the wars is the massive destruction of the infrastructure, right. The old buildings, right, and things like that. And it makes you wonder why. You look at it's almost like in the 1800s, we were able to see what the old world was like. And that was the last glimpse of it. And then they showed it to you and said, okay, here's what you had, but here's what we're going to give you. And that's the new industrial revolution side of things, right? The new modern way of living that is, like you mentioned before, about us being in tune with nature and being one with it rather than just consuming. And that's where we are today. We are in the era of consuming. And that respect for nature has decreased in so many people, and we've lost that connection. I mean, how many people go out of their house in bare feet anymore and go ground for a couple minutes a day? You don't see that kind of stuff anymore.
Right. Yeah. I'm not going to sit on a high horse and say I do it all the time, but every now and then I try to ground, and it definitely makes me feel more sane than when I'm just sitting in front of a computer all day like I normally do. So I recommend it for sure. Not a doctor, but I think what's so fascinating when it comes to the Tartaria subject as a whole is what seems to be a harmony or a resonance with the natural forces, rather than, as you put it, what seems to be the case post World Fair, which is like this, top down, we're in control of nature. Nature is ours. We control nature, and we're just going to use it for whatever we can get out of it. Whereas it seemed like in the past, the philosophy was more so, if we take care of nature, nature will take care of us, and slowly but surely the empire, spread its tentacles across the earth. And this time we're in now, seemingly there's no respect for the earth. There's no harmony. And, Roman, who I know you've spoke with from the Rising from the Ashes podcast, he was just on the show, and he was breaking down some strange things he found in royal chambers, where they would have a crown and a scepter and a globe, and possibly all of these things were components in a type of energy device. And I've heard you describe on your episode 13 of the Great Deception podcast on star forts, I heard you describe them also as batteries, right? This kind of word magic, but more technically speaking, a battery, it is also another word for a star fort, but it's also a storage place of energy, right? Very curious that there's this sort of double entendre or double meaning there. But back to my point about nature, it seems like there is or was an energy field that buildings like cathedrals are tapping into. Have you found anything similar to that to corroborate that?
Yeah, I've looked into it a little bit, and actually I just finished reading a book called The Sacred Network, which looks into the ley lines in France and how a lot of the architecture in France is built along these ley lines. And it does seem that there was some sort of energetic grid that they were working off with these buildings. And then, like you mentioned, you look at things like star forts. Now, I know the traditional explanation of star forts is that they were defensive structures built, to not only control the sea and be a first line of defense from any sort of waterbound attack, but they also were outposts and things like that. But then when you start looking at it and, you start asking questions as to, well, if I look at this, why would we design these intricate patterns if it was just for defensive purposes? Why would we go through all this work if it's just a defensive structure? There were gardens, immaculate gardens and areas fields that they would manage around these star forts that it almost seems like they were interacting. And anyone that's familiar with cymatics, which is the study of vibration and frequency, will know that there are these cymatic patterns that water will tend to take depending on the vibration that is put on it. And some of these patterns seem to have healing abilities, natural abilities. And we get into thinking about, okay, well, maybe these star forts had some sort of ability to manipulate the water, or the water was a tool of these star forts and could be used to not only energize the fort itself, the landscape around it, but also bring healing to the people that are in that area. Right. Whether they consume the water itself or they're in that general area with that cymatic frequency being played, they may have been a healing center as well. And one of the things you find with the star forts is, you'll see the pattern above ground, but what most people don't understand is that more than 50% of the star fort is usually subterranean. It's usually underground. So there's this multi-layer component to it as well that, I think needs to be looked into. I think just the narrative of being told that these were just defensive positions and, they were just for war. I find that very hard to believe, being of the sheer vast number of star forts and the fact that you find them across the globe.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I can think of one that's not too far away from me. I think it's called the Fort Nathan Hale. It's like run by the National Guard now, but allegedly there is a star fort in New Haven Harbor in Connecticut on the east sort of shore of the New Haven Harbor. And with that, point you just pointed out, 80 to 50% of these structures are underground, meaning 50% of the building itself, not 50% of the star forts in a list. But yeah, I think that's very telling because look at where all of these military bases end up. They always are going underground. We hear stories about underground tunnels under most cities with a university that was built in the 1800s. It just feels like that was a lot more customary of a practice than we're led to believe. You look at like a McDonald's on a corner and you don't necessarily think that there's an underground component to that, and there might not be. I'm not suggesting there is, but in the 1800s, something like an underground tunnel would have been very advantageous for like a university because, it snows. You can't move the same way you could in a big bad snowstorm. They didn't have plows back then. They just had shovels. So, it might have been a technological weather workaround, but I think that's just a clever little excuse that they give us. Oh yeah, they built all these underground tunnels so the students would be able to go to class in the winter and no one would get wet. And it's like, really? Because I've heard stories of my grandfather who had to walk 2-3 miles to public school through the snow over hills. So they weren't doing that for everybody, but it definitely is surprising to find how many, the sheer number of underground structures there are in this country.
Oh, the tunnels and everything. Yeah. And one more thing before we go too far from star forts, I'm not sure if everybody knows, but the Statue of Liberty is actually placed on a star fort.
Yeah.
So if you don't think there's any significance to star forts, we know that when they put their symbols in certain spots, it's for a reason. So
I got to give a shout out. I got to give a shout out to my buddy Rob B, he's in the Telegram chats every day. Very kind dude. Gave me a really nice Christmas gift this year. He mentioned recently that the stones that built the star fort underneath the Statue of Liberty came from a quarry, an ancient quarry, only like 3 towns east of me in Guilford, Connecticut. And you're
Okay.
you're a Connecticut boy too, so you're pretty familiar. I don't know how familiar you are with the shoreline, but yeah, apparently those stones that built that star fort come from the Guilford quarry in Guilford.
Wow.
Yeah.
Small world.
Yeah. Shout out to Rob. He's a really cool dude. He knows a lot about stone. He knows a lot about masonry. So it's good to have a resource like him. You know, I didn't expect that at all, but we've been getting into this topic with stones and structures. So is synchronistically, Rob's our guy when it comes to that kind of stuff. He usually has a clue or an answer. But yeah, I think star forts, you know, what's so interesting about them is a little bit of what you mentioned with the potential for them to be interacting with the environment around them. And I hadn't even thought of the water purification potential of these structures, but it would make sense. You know, you go to a place where maybe there's not clean running water. How are you going to get, you know, what are you going to do? You're not just going to boil it all. Maybe we're talking about ancient Tartarian technology that's far more advanced than anything we're aware of. We might have it, but we're not aware of it in a public sense in this day and age. Seems like it was much more prevalent only 100 or so years ago. I mean, we're talking the railways, we're talking airships, we're talking canals, all these things that seem advanced were being done seemingly with more frequency only 100 or so years ago.
Well, yeah, in the 1800s, in the United States alone, there was over 90 star forts that were built. So you think about that, and it's like, oh, wow, that's an interesting, and again, that's according to the narrative. So if you're believing everything that we're told, that the majority of these were built in the 1800s and after 1850 too, which is, so that's later in the game if you think about it. We're not too far off from munitions there, and that's what they said eventually ran the star forts out of functionality, was that once explosive munitions came around, they weren't as defensive a position anymore. So they were a liability almost. So they, for the most part, they were just let go. Very few of them were maintained. Some of them were even dismantled intentionally. And you just have to wonder why. We couldn't find another use for these structures. And yeah, I mean, you go down and you look at the one off of Key West, which is, I believe it's Fort Jefferson. You're looking at over 16 million bricks it took to put that thing together. So,
right.
And again, we're
surrounded by water too. Yeah.
Yeah. It's out in the middle of the ocean. Yeah.
It's like they were either, you know, building it directly off of a boat, or maybe they had a lower water level or something, but it's fascinating this construction and how it's just really prolific. You know, when we think of time, we tend to think that things get more advanced as time goes on, and I think overwhelmingly what comes to the forefront when you look into Tartaria is the fact that is not the case at all. It seems like we've gone through a de-evolution as far as our technical application of things like bricks, metal, you know, stone. And I'm not an architect. I know you made that preface at the beginning of the episode I was listening to, like, hey, I'm not an architect. So, but it's extremely thought-provoking at the very least. And, you know, we may not be qualified to speak technically on these things, but we talk enough about it that I think the right people will start to hear it and bring some maybe more professional answers to the table. Might not be exactly what we're hoping, but at the end of the day, I'm just interested in figuring out the truth, because it seems more likely that they're lying to us about the truth than it's just like, you know, not interesting enough for people to remember. I don't think that's ever the case, where things are just like, oh yeah, there's nothing there, so people moved on. It's like, no. They're covering this up. They don't want us to know what the hell these star forts are about.
Well, and what's interesting too is, you know, when you say that, I laugh, because whenever people get close to something is usually when the media starts attacking. And earlier this year, Bloomberg put out a hit piece on Tartaria, and they interviewed the kid from Tartaria and Meltdown, Red Bricks. And that was their main source of information. And so they went to an extreme.
They went to the guy who
make...
says that every mountain is a melted building.
Yes. Yeah. So that's who their expert was. But it was just a hit piece. They went in and they were talking about how, this is, again, these people are crazy. They're talking of buildings, not matching, and that these buildings that were built of staff or plaster, that's all they were. They were just temporary buildings. So all these world fairs, all that stuff, all the Tartaria talk, anything related to it is nonsense. And they just basically shot it down with a little hit piece. And of course they tied in QAnon, they tied in January 6th.
Which, by the way, that Red Bricks guy is like a European dude. I don't even think he's from the U.S.
He's Norwegian.
Yeah, so
he's from Norway.
He really has a lot invested in Trump.
Yeah, it was just like, so they just, and so that, when I read that article, at first I was like, okay, maybe this, and I like to do this with myself. I like to flip it on myself. And, because right now I'm big into believing that there is something more there. And I said, well, what if you're just an idiot? And what if this is all just nonsense? What if it's just a psyop somebody threw out there to get people looking in one direction when something else is going the other way, which they've been known to do in the past. But the more I look into it, there's too many holes in the story.
Right.
I mean, from the World's Fairs, you can poke holes in those stories all day, and there is no rational explanation to it. And like Howdy says in his book, is that he's talked with architects and talked with people with experience, and that a lot of this stuff isn't possible in the timeline that we're told with the technology that we're told they had. So it boils down to two things. Either A, the timeline is off, or B, they had some sort of technology that allowed them to build these massive, extravagant structures that we don't know about. But getting back to what you said, if we think we are the highest evolution here and we're the best, best version of everything ever, we're not going to listen to that. You're just going to poo-poo that away and say, nope, yeah, no, we were just good, and then we lost the ability to do it. Well, how? Right. How do you lose the ability to? It's like, Don Pettit when he says, we can't go back to the moon because we lost all technology and it's too hard to build again. I mean, that was 50 years ago. That's 50 years. We're talking hundreds of years. So, yeah, I just have a tough time. And the more I start to see the holes. Now, do I have all the answers? No. But I'm starting to be able to show little bits of evidence that suggest an alternate. Now, we need that verifiable proof, but that's probably buried deep in the Vatican archives, and you or I are not going to have access to that.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the first friends I ever made when I was sort of taking this road into conspiracy with all the rabbit holes that litter the way, and this guy is like 10 years older than me. We became buddies, just started smoking weed together, and he had mentioned that he visited the Vatican. And I started telling me some weird stuff. And then he was like, man, he's like, I really don't want to get into it, but you should look up this guy, Jordan Maxwell, because he talks a lot about this stuff. And I was like, okay, and that kind of sent me down this incredible rabbit hole. Very fortunate for that, dude. Shout out to you, Mo. I hope you listen to the podcast. But anyways, when you brought up the World's Fair, what came to mind was this gentleman by the name of H.H. Holmes, and how, I don't think this is talked much about when we're having these Tartaria discussions, but tangentially it is, because we're talking about a time period that was, a reset or a culture creation, right? And this theme of the bloodthirsty maniac, or the sensible, unreasonable, irrational killer came into the cultural zeitgeist around this time. And I find it really fascinating that this H.H. Holmes guy, he had this murder mansion, creepy, weird building that people would go to, they never leave. And then in this 100 or so years that follows that event, you see incredible just spike statistically in those types of crimes. I mean, maybe that type of record keeping wasn't available previously, so we just didn't have a record of how many times people committed those kind of things. But I find that absolutely worth examining further. Like, you know, we talk all about culture creation. Well, this seems to me to fit into this model of what the new world after that time period looked like. You know, this criminal being an archetype, you know, a bloodthirsty maniac.
Yeah, and that you would need protection,
Right.
And that's what I think, and I think you nailed it spot on. You do see this rise of the, you know, the bloodthirsty, the serial killer after this H.H. Holmes story, which, yeah, in during the World's Fair, supposedly he had the World Fair Hotel, which they called his murder castle. And he would basically, you know, think about it. I mean, you have millions, supposedly, of people coming into town for the fair, you know, needing lodging.
It was 1/3 of every American at the time. I think it was something like 2 out of 10 Americans had like gone to this World's Fair. It was like a really huge number of people, which, you know, the population was considerably smaller back then. But yeah, I mean, everybody conceivably would have had someone in their community that would have been to this World's Fair.
Yeah, because Chicago only had about 1 million people at the time, and about 27.5 million people made it to the fair. So you're talking, you know, people from all over, not only the United States, but also from Europe. There was a heavy European and even South America. People were coming up for it at the time. But yeah, so you're having no better place, you know, for a bloodthirsty killer than this place where you're just having people walking around in almost a foreign land, because people didn't travel as much back then either. And to show up. And one of the things that I found fascinating in the research was when you look at the World's Fair, one of the things that one of the people said about the people that were at the fair, it was almost like they were in a trance. They were under a spell as they're walking around the fair. And then after the fair, the spell was over. And I found that really fascinating, because if you look at the videos or pictures of the old World's Fairs, you see very similar people, right? They're all dressed basically the same with the same hats. You know, women are dressed but they're all just walking around kind of looking in a daze, and like almost like they were placed there, not knowing where they were put, you know, like, and so I found that quite fascinating that they would say that. And that as you start looking at the fairs more and more, and think about that, I mean, to get 27 million people to Chicago, granted, it was over a 6-month time frame, but still we're talking, and it was all railway transportation. You didn't have planes, or they weren't utilizing airships that we know of to transport people. So it was all by rail and by ship coming, you know, across from Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I never identified as this, but after having conversations on the podcast with people who identify as empaths, you know, someone I think even said, "Oh, you must be an empath." I have always had that aside, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I'm not going to go and tell people I am that. But that aside, I've always felt a very strong uncomfortability in groups larger than 50 to 60, you know, like concerts, carnivals, anytime I've ever been to anything like that, extremely uncomfortable. And I'm like taller than the average person. So it's not like I'm like, you know, claustrophobic or anything. I can see my way out of the crowd just fine. But yeah, there's just this sense of disturbing energy. And I'm not antisocial by any means, but I am sort of, I do prefer to keep to myself. So, and I'm pointing that out because I wonder how much that plays into something like that. You know, you go to an event, possibly the first time in American history when this many people were gathered around for such a thing. There's an atmosphere of human energy. But now I bring that up because in line with all this electric universe Tartaria stuff, it could be that they were generating some kind of energy field with the buildings themselves, and then the people in a sort of like electric relationship come in and complete the circuit, and that's how the flow gets going, you know. And then they have all of these ideas, this archetype for what America is gonna be. It's like a spell. That's what it seems like to me. And the reason why
Exactly.
the reason why I bring this up is because I was just reading a book by Walter Bosley, Latitude 33, all about Disney World, and how this carousel that was placed in Disneyland in California, it was placed on an intersection of 3 ley lines. And I think you mentioned that either now or in the Starford episode I listened to, you know, ley lines are subjective. Everybody has different, you know, a different idea of where the ley lines possibly are. But this author points to a geographical significant sort of fault line. So there is something to it on a geographical level. There's a mass concentration of granite at this one spot. And when they put this carousel on it, Walter in this book alleges that maybe it's generating this sort of orb of energy, this carousel with the rotational effect. So not that I know what was at the World's Fair, but you know, if they had a carousel or a Ferris wheel or something that's rotating like that, that could possibly be an explanation for it. Just speculative, but have you looked into amusement parks or anything like that?
No, I haven't really. Although, you know, Chicago did have the world's largest Ferris wheel that was created for that. It held over 2,500 people at a time. It took about 10 minutes to make a full revolution. And it was so big and so massive that, you know, it was the spectacle of the show. They had to find something that rivaled the Eiffel Tower that France had just put out a few years earlier. So Ferris decided that he would create this wheel. Well, the interesting thing about it, not only did they use it for Chicago, they broke it down and then reused it in 1904 in St. Louis World Fair. So they reused it, and then at the end of the fair, they blew it up. So again, it's one of those where, and when you said that about the energy, it's like, okay, maybe there is something to that this Ferris wheel was bringing in the energy for the fair or had some way to interact with the people. And then at the end of the fair, we have to destroy this thing because we can no longer use it for our use. So it cannot be used by the people. Let's blow it up.
Wow. Yes.
And
yes. Like they don't want any more interference. Like we made the magic happen. If this thing keeps running, it's just going to interfere. Wow.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah. So that's one of the things I was looking at too, was kind of the energy around it, because when you see them destroying it, and you mentioned this earlier, we're talking a time when America didn't have we're talking around the Civil War, post Civil War, when America was borderline bankrupt. So to be putting up and investing all this money into these buildings and these fairs, many of which lost money in the end, and we know how these people do not like to lose money, it really makes you wonder what was the purpose of these, and the placement as well, because you start looking at some of the sites. I mean, Buffalo, New York, why would there be all of this up in Buffalo? And then you're like, oh, well, you have Niagara Falls, right. You have the Erie Canal, you have all of these structures and things that are up there that are very energetic. And Buffalo, yeah. Although now it may seem as kind of an afterthought, back then, that's a heavy, energetic based area. Right. And that's what we see a lot and it's not verifiable though, right? I mean, like you said, ley lines are kind of subjective right now. There's no definite answer as to where the ley lines are, what the source of them is, what are their powers. It's one of these things that, I like watching Michelle Gibson. She's one of my favorite researchers, and she's done a lot of work on it. And actually that's how she started in this, was she had a map of America and just started drawing lines connecting cities and things, and it ended up making this giant, almost flower of life pattern that she found within America that she believes is the ley line grid here. And
very similar to what Peter Shampoo has done. I spoke with Peter on the podcast, and I found his book before interviewing him, and he has a very similar arrangement, not a flower of life, but it's a circle, and you basically can see it in the way that the shape of the North American continent is. It's kind of like a yin yang, the way Mexico kind of curves, and then you see this like fractalizing. But yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, and it's literally figuratively a global topic to wrap your head around. It's immense. But yeah, I want to take it back to the point about they didn't make any money, because I think my biggest suspicion, and I try to stay as open-minded as possible, but I also like to be realistic. My biggest suspicion through hearing like we mentioned this previously, the really temporary structures that they supposedly built and then destroyed. My thought was, well, is there an insurance sort of scam going on here? They spend all this money to build a project. They probably, didn't pay the workers as much as they needed to. There's a lot of like money trickery that goes on with these big projects. I wondered how much insurance scams or, getting their insurance money back somehow played into it. But to learn that they didn't make, they lost money with these kind of things, it doesn't add up. It's like, well, yeah, they're not just burning it down to recoup on the insurance claim, that's for sure. We can't say that about the World Trade Center, but we can probably say that about the World's Fair.
Well, yeah, when you start looking at the World's Fair, what we're told is that there was usually one or two permanent structures at every fair. And that was for insurance purposes, because for them to be able to bring in these fine works of art and have these, what they would call palaces of fine arts, where they would bring in all sorts of artwork, sculptures from around the world. I mean, we're talking millions of dollars worth of artwork. And so these buildings were the ones that we were told had to be permanent facilities for insurance purposes to allow these works to come in there. Now, if you believe that, that's very interesting, because, you see some of these other buildings and they look just as structurally sound, but yet we're told they're temporary. An interesting point I've heard recently about the buildings themselves is, they try and play it off that some of these buildings were temporary or they were built of staff or plaster. A lot of the houses at the time were made of that same material, and they weren't made as a temporary structure. So to just simply say that, oh, these things were just meant to be built for these 4 years to be torn down, the temporary ones, that's even a bit of a stretch, because to even make a building out of staff, it is going to last a decent amount of time. Now, it's obviously not going to last as long as stone would, but the fact that they did create these buildings and then just destroyed them shows you that there was something being hidden, because these buildings could have lasted on for years and years and years. And in fact, some of them did, because some of the fairs, there was pushback from the local populace that we would like to keep some of these buildings. So there were some of these quote unquote temporary structures that lasted on for years and years after the fact.
Yeah.
So dicey.
I grew up in a house that was, I think, built in the 19th century. And luckily my dad is very, handy and knows how to, fix her up, so to speak. And he was able to take this basically ticky-tacky roof that they had connecting what was once a dining room to the kitchen and, replace it. Unfortunately, when I was a kid, there was a fire while the house was under construction, and that part of the house was destroyed, a very small sort of part of the house. But it's odd, that claim that, oh, it was just temporary. Because, yeah, to your point, I mean, I lived in a house that was built like that. It's just the way that they built houses back then. And, a lot of people who live in New England probably have similar stories in their family of like little house renovations that had to be done because there's just odd, weird things that are built. Like my childhood home has a diamond-shaped window. I don't think there's any other houses in the whole neighborhood, not let alone on the street, the whole neighborhood with that exact type of window. So there was an odd shift at some point in America where we went from sort of this freestyle form of architecture to a very standard, Now you see with these new neighborhoods that are built, they're all pretty much the same design, maybe save for like a few variations in color or like where a garage is placed or not placed. But, we went from sort of an open landscape of architecture to a very fixed, you hear like the whole brutalism thing come into the mix when we talk about Tartaria, because there is this very strong contrast. You have brutalist buildings, which for those who aren't familiar with that term, look it up. You'll probably recognize maybe the school you went to, high school, maybe your post office has this sort of theme to it. Very concrete, square, no beauty at all. That's supposedly made from a communist philosophy, whereas a lot of these structures that we would consider Renaissance, Victorian, they seem to be built with a sort of flair, a design. But as we examine them, we start to see maybe they're like conducting energy. And then you compare that to the brutalist structures, there's no conduction going on at all. They're just blocks. They're straight up just like static energy, it seems like.
Yeah, and we went from that structure that you were talking about where they could, it's almost like the buildings were some sort of energy device or part of the energy. Whereas now, if you look at it and you look at the term electricity, it's the electric city. And if you look at a city, an overview of a city these days, it looks an awful lot like a motherboard to a computer. So you're seeing that, although it may not be the same way it was before, I think functionally the architecture still acts in the same manner. It still has that property where it needs, obviously needs the human in it too now for the battery, like you mentioned before. But I think there is something to that. There is some energetic basis to the way that cities are laid out. And even to this day, I think it's still, they have some sort of function with the way energy is harnessed or drawn or used in those city areas based on the landscape itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And when we're getting into the occult sort of dimensions of it, this is not a new practice. The idea of building a city in the proportions of a man, I think that's sort of what they would do with temples. They would shape them so that like the priests were at the head of the building and you walked in through the feet of the building, and like the priests come in through the arms of the building, and the people sit in the sort of body of the building. But then when you see that applied to the city, it almost seems like if we were to think of it as a computer or some sort of way to organize this energy, it almost seems like the city hall or the places where people are governing the city from are in central locations where the energy might be funneled into. On an esoteric occult level, it seems like at least symbolically that's the case, because I love that description of a motherboard. Computer chip also comes up a lot. I just had a conversation with Nick Hinton who sort of described it that way, and others have used that same description. I think, flying into a city, I've never flown as an adult, only when I was a kid, so I don't quite remember the look of the land from the sky. But you hear that a lot from people who fly across the country, and you see these cities in the distance. They don't look symbiotic. They look like some kind of parasitic techno-humanist or transhumanist, insert into the natural landscape. And in contrast, when you look at these old world civilizations, especially like when we focus in on the Star Fort, it looks like they're in complete harmony with nature. And I don't know if you're familiar with that History Channel program where they showed how quickly our structures would be eaten up by nature. But it kind of makes sense that we would want to live in harmony with nature if we expect our civilization to have any longevity, because it's pretty obvious to us that nature is much more powerful than us, and through storms, through plant growth, through the shifting of water and the ground itself, there's a lot that can change in one given location. So to be sort of in harmony with the forces of nature you're much more likely to last than if you just ignorantly go about it the way we're going about it, it seems, in our Western world, where some of our cities are built in places that flood every year. Some of our cities are built in places where hurricanes just come and destroy everything. I mean, it doesn't seem like we're masters of our environment. We're trying to master it, but we never really, it seems like we're just upsetting the harmony, creating more resistance from nature with the way we build.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think we've gone away from that, any concern of working, and all the climate change nonsense aside. I think we've gone away from having any connection to nature for the most part, especially in the cities. When you get to the outskirts, you're starting to see a lot of people wanting to get off the grid, wanting to start things like homesteads and get more connected with the earth and with the land around them, because they are seeing that what we are doing it's not conducive to longevity. I mean, you mentioned it before about, lifespans and things like that, about how possibly, you look even in the Bible, there were people that lived for hundreds of years, and that was without all this modern technology that we have. So it's almost as if, we have taken that step back, and based on that last 1800s reset where we moved into the Industrial Revolution, and we're in that, Rockefeller medicine, Rockefeller school systems, where we've taken out any connection to nature, and it's more about science and controlling and man being the ultimate, whereas in the past nature was the ultimate. That was, we respected it, we worked with it, and now it's like, no, I don't care. The mindset of humanity is we're going to do what we need to do to survive, and if it takes nature to suffer, so be it. Although the politicians will tell you different, because they're looking for some nice tax incentives and things like that. They don't really give a shit about the environment either. But we have, I really feel like we've lost that touch. And that's why, when you said before, we always think we're the most civilized and most evolved. I really think, like you were saying, we've taken a small step back. We've lost that connection with nature and the ability to work with it to not only heal humanity, but to heal the planet itself.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you even go back to the old world structures. A lot of them just seem so advanced compared to what Sacsayhuaman, where there are stones that literally are so fit perfectly. And we're not talking, hand-sized stones. We're talking human-sized stones, huge stones. And they're, fit so precisely that you can't even slide a sheet of paper in between them. And Great Wall of China, another example we kind of mentioned, it's going along the tops of mountains. It's not going, around mountains. It's going along the ridge lines of mountains, which, I don't know if we could pull something like that off, with the technology we have today now. And I see in my own backyard, and it's awesome speaking with you, because you, more than most people, probably understand what I'm talking about when I talk about the stone rows, being from Connecticut as well. I mean, you've seen them, Matt. They're pretty massive in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
It's a feat. I mean, to suggest that it was purely the work of slaves or, Indians or whatever they explain it, farmers and oxes. I mean, some of these boulders are gigantic, megalithic, and they're comprised in these stone rows that go up mountains in the same way, where you're like, okay, I could see how maybe humans built that, but like, why? Because that's very difficult. Like, who's gonna go through the effort of putting a stone row up the side of a hill just to say, yeah, that's my property? It's like, it just doesn't, add up. And I'm so fascinated with this whole Tartaria subject for the same reason, because a place like Hartford, Connecticut, a place like New Haven, Connecticut, I've had past guest Andreas Zertis tell me that, the whole Gold Coast, Fairfield, Greenwich, that area has some connections to Tartaria. These are places we've been, we can visit. We've probably seen buildings that might be Tartarian and just didn't know what we were looking at until you find or stumble upon a subject like this, and it gives you a whole new lens to re-examine the place you grew up. Have you, looked into our state at all and seen what's going on here in the far past?
Yeah, no, I haven't dug too much into Connecticut. I'm up in Mass right now, and I just connected with a guy the other day who was telling me about some megaliths up here in the area and a couple towns over. So I'm hoping to go get a little more direction from him, so I'm not just wandering aimlessly in the woods, to find out where they are and go check them out. But being up here in New England, there is so much history. I'm with you in the sense that I think we have a little bit more than obviously the West Coast when it comes to our history. We have a little bit more detail out here. It's a little bit more clear. And the more you get out West, the more fuzzy the tale gets. And I always found that interesting, that the whole entire planet was basically developed or populated, but North, specifically America, was just kind of this wild land with these natives that just savages that just ran around for thousands of years. And no one ever thought to come here. No one ever thought to populate here, to build here. The Vikings might have come a couple times by accident, or the Chinese might have made it here by accident. You hear all these stories and it just doesn't make sense. There is something that is being hidden about the history of America that is much more significant in the overall picture than we're being told. I've been looking a lot lately into the Egyptian connection to America, and there's a deep Egyptian connection to America. And it goes as far as even like the Grand Canyon. There's supposedly Egyptian monuments and obelisks and symbols in the Grand Canyon. And you got to ask yourself, how did they get there? That's just that seems like an awfully random spot for the Egyptians to show up if they didn't have some sort of presence here prior.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, so much comes to mind. We've talked about this a lot on the show, and I've mentioned before plenty of times Ross Ben and his work at the book Great Mystery Philadelphia. It's right next to me. Should get it right. And he mentions a African king who leaves Africa in 846 AD, something like that. There's a story of him sailing across the Atlantic with a huge number of ships and is never seen again until maybe a couple decades later. A guy comes back and he's like, hey, yeah, we didn't make it, but we need more ships, and then a whole huge another fleet leaves and they're never seen again. So it's like, did they really not make it anywhere? Like, was that just a cover story so no one would follow? That seems to be the case. And then the convenient connection to this whole history of what we're describing sort of sarcastically here of the savages, right? That was much a big part of the narrative given to us with the World's Fair. That oh yeah, America, this is how it was, and there was this caveman like person who was here, and they didn't really have a lot going on, yet somehow they were so advanced that they inspired the Confederacy, right? The Confederacy inspired the founding fathers to come up with the whole ideas that they, were given to them by God and the Indians, right? It's just, these things don't make any sense. It's just, I don't know. And it is touchy too, because people don't like hearing this kind of stuff, especially in New England. You say the history's a little more established here, but still, like, if you come across something that maybe is in contrary to what people have established. I mean, we see that with Shakespeare, right? Some people have talked about Shakespeare being someone else than the Staffordshire guy, but there's this whole industry of tourism in Staffordshire, England, that, they don't want that. They don't want to lose that, so they're not going to support any idea that goes against Shakespeare being that guy from that town, right? And I think there's a very similar dynamic with history all over the world, where certain people attach themselves financially to a idea that may or may not be true, but it becomes true because they attach themselves to it, and then over time, people just take it as, an accepted truth when it's a misconstruction.
Well, yeah, and we get it up here, especially, the Pilgrim story, all these different historical narratives that we're told that factually they just don't make sense. It doesn't add up. And you're right, though. You have to be gentle with this because there's a lot of people who can't have any cognitive dissonance with this. You cannot break the narrative with them or show any cracks in it. And that's one of the things I think that this time frame is doing more so than ever before, is it's exposing the cracks in the narrative. And now we have the ability, like we're doing right now, to get together and share research that we found.
Right.
Whereas in the past, this research never would have even made it to public. I mean, the papers would have been destroyed. The person would have been, written off as being crazy, and that would have been the end of it. But as we start to dig back, now you're starting to see that the native history is so much more powerful and so much more civilized than we were told. But yet you go back to the World's Fair, like you were saying, they had human zoos, where they would take groups of natives, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was, people down from the swamp, and they'd put them in what they considered, quote unquote, their habitat in a zoo, at the World Fair, like a zoo. So they were in a containment, and they would live how they would live their normal life. So it was like going to the Bronx Zoo and watching the lion in the lion den. So you could watch these people. I mean, if you can't think of anything that's more racist and more derogatory than putting people into human zoos. But that's where we were. And that was part of the World's Fair also. I mean, Chicago was called the Great White City. And it wasn't just because they whitewashed all the buildings. It was because this was the announcement of the Great European, right? This was the European era. The Industrial Revolution is going to bring in the power of the white, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Right.
And, that didn't sit well with a lot of people. So, it's where we are now. But yeah, they put people in, and this was something they did across multiple World's Fairs. It wasn't just one where they had human zoos. So it was them over and over showing you their story, their narrative about these, these primitive folk that just lived off the land. They didn't live in any structures. They never built anything, and that gets you into like the burial mounds. Right. You look at the burial mounds and that's a whole nother rabbit hole in itself, because you find these mounds across America. And in the 1800s, a lot of them were destroyed and just bulldozed over, and right. Whatever remnants were inside were taken either by the Smithsonian or just buried in place.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's definitely, and even up here in New England, we still have stone structures that are pretty much ignored or are really not talked about. A friend mentioned some megaliths that you're going to check out. I'd love to either join you or learn about where those are and find my way up there myself, because there's a whole list that I've started to create of places in New England that I want to visit where there is still evidence of that culture, which, as you put, and I agree with this, we're much more advanced than we're told. And to the point of the human zoos, zoos in themselves with animals in them, not human beings, are extremely fascinating to me, because they're, kind of a remnant of that time period, and like a lot of really strange people have their name as like the title of zoos, because they were the founders, they put all the money behind it and whatever it is. But it is curious that and I'm only bringing this up really quickly because I think this deserves a whole deep dive, like the strange history of zoos and the implications of that, because I used to think it was a good thing. I used to be like, what, people in the city, they don't, have the ability to go to the forest as much as somebody who lives in a rural area. So they might not appreciate nature as much without a zoo, so I think people should appreciate nature, appreciate animals. Maybe they'll litter less if they did that, if they appreciated animals. So I used to be in favor of zoos, but now it feels like a lot of those groups that set those zoos up had an agenda ultimately to maybe some aims that are not good for us as a species, and even not good as animals or the environment in general. You know, you see this with the whole climate change BS, as you put it, and it made me think, like, you know who really believes in climate change? People who live in cities. You know, it's like, it seems like the people who live in cities who interact with nature the least are the ones who think that nature is fucked up. And it's like, no, you guys are in a really fucked up part of nature. But if you go to a wild area, and there still is many wild areas here in the planet, you'll see how powerful nature truly is, you know. And I think, again, that's a little bit of a tangent from the other side of where I wanted to go with what you said, which is the ability for them to, you know, alchemize this story of the great European, because I think it's more than just, and this is a touchy subject for sure, so we don't have to spend too much time on it, but I think it's worth noting that, like, this time period when this was talked about, they still didn't really agree, you know, that the human species was one homogeneous species. They were still thinking like, oh, there's different species and they all intermingle, but now we kind of have this idea that, oh yeah, we're all one race of being, which is true. I don't disagree with that. But if we're going to be extremely scientific about it, which is not exactly my thing either, technically there are different types of human beings. There are different variations, just like we see in all the other different types of living beings here on the planet. There are variations, right? Based on what environment our genomes are expressing themselves determines their direction in the future as they adapt to the, you know, factors in their environment. So that being said, you know, I'm kind of going around in circles here, man. I'm sorry, but the point I'm trying to connect this all to was, I heard from a very close person in my life, a mentor, so to speak, who was raised in a Pueblo Native American culture. He's a Pueblo guy who made his way out to New Haven. He told me that the medicine wheel represents the 4 races of the earth: the white man, the yellow man, the black man, and the red man. These are his words, not mine, folks. And he said that the white man has, every race has a special ability, and it's based on an element, right? The black race is water, the yellow race is air, the red race is earth, and the white race is fire. And when you talked about this, like, great European, it kind of brought that to mind, because if you think about the Industrial Revolution, it's primarily wrapped around metallurgy, which is completely fire. I mean, you need fire to work with metal, and that's what the Industrial Revolution really wraps around, is the use of metal, the use of these different types of chemistry. And I think it's absolutely fascinating to point that out, because then you start to see maybe the magical side of what was really going on with the World Fair. You know, when you see that there are these sort of different expressions of the human being, and they're not all, you know, working towards the same agenda. Some of them want, you know, their root race to be better than others, and then there's the whole white supremacy thing, which is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a more general kind of chemical relationship, you know, fire and earth interacting, you know, the red man and the white man interacting, and they kind of alchemically laid it out that way through the World's Fair. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm...
And you just blew my mind with that connection, because if you think about it, what happened in the 1800s over and over, it was fire. There were these massive fires, whether it was New York City, whether it was the World's Fairs, wherever you would go, there were these massive fires in the 1800s that, you know, as they're ushering in this new era of quote unquote the white man, as you know, what we said with Chicago, that's really fascinating, because it's almost like they use that fire to bring in this, usher in this new era, and just by straight destruction. Because I mean, one of the most fascinating fires I ever looked at was in 1871. You have the Great Chicago Fire, which took place. But at the on the same exact day, you have the Peshtigo fire, which is up north in Wisconsin, and then across Lake Michigan on the other side of it, at the same time, you have a fire in Michigan as well. The fire in Michigan burnt about 1.5 million acres. The fire up in Peshtigo burned like 1.2 million acres. But yet the only fire that's really talked about is that fire in Chicago that, supposedly started with a cow knocking over a candle with his tail and burning down the whole city. So that's one where, how is there 3? We're not talking, brush fires. We're talking over 1 million acres burned in 2 cities, and then Chicago being all but wiped out on the same exact day.
Right. Wow.
Yeah, there's just all sorts of stories like that with fires in the 1800s. And when you said that, something clicked that, man, that the white man being fire, that may be their tool to usher in their era.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, these are my friend Amos's words, not mine. And I think that comes from, things he's learned from his teachings or wherever he learned in his tribe or whatever else he learned in his life. He's not a simple person. He's a complex person, just like you and I. But I think the interesting thing of what he said was also that our power is not exactly something we know how to yield. Like water is the strength of the root race, the black root race. And if you consider like the fact that, they were some of the first navigators of the ocean, that puts it in a whole nother respect, because now you hear like this kind of almost racist sounding thing like, oh, black people don't know how to swim. So when you hear that their power is water, you're like, huh, what? But no, I mean, they are really like some of the world's oldest ocean navigators. And their kingdoms in Africa were so great because they were some of the first traders, and I think that's a big thing in the Tartaria topic that I don't hear mentioned enough. Andreas talks about it sometimes, but the Berbers, right? We have this idea that the barbarians, they're sounds a lot like Tartarians, but the barbarians are just like awful. And if you're a barbarian, you're terrible, you're a bad person. But, it doesn't come from war. It comes from a group of people that were at some point the enemy of the people that we get our history from. I mean, that seems to be how simple it is. So now we're living in a time where you mention black, white, red, yellow, and it could get you in some trouble. But I think people are most open or are more open-minded when they come to a show like this. So if somebody wants to clip this and take it out of context, please let me take the blame, not Matt, because I said it all, not Matt. But
please.
But that's how it is, unfortunately. And I think there's something to be said about that, because it's where things have been demonized that you find the propaganda, and they've demonized us having an open discourse about race. Anybody who has our skin color cannot talk about race this openly because we might be racist or we might be, white supremacist, right? But at the same time, I've had podcasts with folks that I disagree with, I agree with, so there's no part of me that represents that at all. It's very obvious, but they can take it and use it against you and totally turn a bunch of people off from learning more about maybe what was being said just because of that one little point, just because. So I think that's, that kind of fits into the Tartarian topic, because now, like you pointed out with the Red Bricks interview there, that he was in a sort of mainstream outlet getting interviewed. That's, how they do it. They take an extreme, portray it as the norm, and then everybody writes that whole topic off and no education happens. It's just ignorance from there on.
Yeah. Oh, you're absolutely right. And that's the easy way to diffuse all this, right? Is to just say, oh, well, that's just ignorant. That's not how it goes. And that's the main argument you get a lot of times, is just that, well, how come we never heard about this stuff? Well, how come it's not in the history books? Mm-hmm. Well, that's That's the $1 million question. Why isn't it in the history books? And why do we have CIA documents saying that there was an effort to erase Tartaria from the history books? I mean, that's in writing in CIA documents. So there is, again, if we want to get back to the term conspiracy, there is a conspiracy right there. Right. They have intentionally gotten rid of any mention or cultural relativity around the word Tartar. Now, why? And then, you start looking at other things, and these are stupid little things, but like tartar sauce, right? I mean, they give you this kind of nasty, white, gooey, gross sauce. And yeah, that's tartar sauce. That's what's supposed to be our memory of Tartaria.
Think about that though. What do we eat with tartar sauce? Fish, right?
Yep.
Who's fishing? People who travel the seas, people who trade in that time period when boats were the only way to get around, get far distances conceivably, right? So I think that's an interesting association. But then tar and feather is another one. People in that Middle Ages time period would get tar and feathered, and tar is considered, kind of a bad thing, even though I've used pine tar for hair products and toothpaste, and it's great.
Oh yeah. Well, the other interesting thing about it is thinking about the area that Tartaria was on the map. Growing up, we were always told that like Siberia was the area you never want to go there. That's like the worst punishment ever, is to be sent to Siberia. Yeah, you're going to be put on a train and sent to Siberia. And you're just going out in this, it's just frigid and barren land that you're going to be sent to. And again, now looking back on it, it has made me rethink the whole Siberian question. And what are they hiding up there? Is there things on the map that we're not told about? Is the map, I haven't been there, so I can't speak to it myself, but
what always stood out to me is the connection with the shamanism. I mean, you see all of these shamanistic cultures up there in Russia, and then, going across that Bering Land Bridge that, Ari talks about, that would have been submerged in the mud flood, possibly. You see that same sort of culture going down into North America, into South America, up through, Russia there. I find that really curious that they kind of also have this very close relationship with the other world, other realms, through plants and through ritual and through this sort of spiritual culture. It's definitely one of those indications. But I want to go into maybe the best evidence, because you brought up like explaining, this to somebody who doesn't possibly agree. What they'll usually say is something to the effect of like, oh yeah, well, how come we haven't heard this before? So do you have any like big Tartaria clues that have stood out to you through your research that you're like, well, if somebody checks this out, then they'll definitely, like it just can't be explained, Obviously the World's Fair, we talked about that, but are there any others that stand out as like good evidence for Tartaria if we were to make a case for it?
Yeah, I haven't dug that far back, Mark, to be honest. Like I said, I started this and it's only been about 6 or 8 months that I've been really diving into, the World Fair and everything. I think I don't know, it's probably about a year now, because I got Howdy's book about last year, Christmas time. So what I'm doing is I'm going backwards. I'm starting in like the 1800s with like the World's Fair, and I'm slowly working my way back towards the 17th century. And there's throughout history, there are a lot of things that you look at and they just don't make sense. You look at the Civil War and Sherman's march down south. Like, why did he just drive right down south and just destroy anything in his path? Was that real? What were they really doing? It wasn't, strategic war area that he was taking over. He was just destroying cities and went right down where the Cherokee center was. But as far as like actual hard proofs, I think my best example that I have now is the World's Fairs. That's what would be kind of my go-to. as, because you can give them a full picture that doesn't add up, from the storyline itself, to the money, to the people that were there, to the technology that was there or not there. That's usually my mainstay to go to. But again, you can look at architecture. Like I look at crystal palaces and things like that as well. That's another type of architecture that goes back. But I've really struggled to find hard evidence, right? Like, you can find all of these circumstantial items that when you put them all together, it makes a pretty good point. But separately, there are holes in it. And that's one of the great jobs that Michelle Gibson, and I keep referencing her because she does some of the best research consistently on this and has hit on so many angles of this, that when you start looking it up and putting the pieces together, it does start to give you a different picture. But, back to your question, I don't have like that smoking gun. I don't have that one piece of evidence that I can go to and say, yep, this is the guarantee. This is absolutely 100% proves Tartaria existed, other than just showing someone an old map where that the land was physically there. It was called Tartaria, and it was on the maps in olden times.
Agreed. Yeah. And I definitely didn't mean to put you on the spot there, because I don't think that, we necessarily need that to go into this topic and find some cool stuff, regardless of whether it fits into the sort of speculative theory that's being laid out in a lot of different YouTube channels and other podcasts. You still learn something about history that at the end of the day, it's valuable, in my opinion. Just looking into the history of New England has led me to find a lot of really cool stuff. But yeah, man, I mean, there was a lot that we left off the table. I'm sure a lot of that people can find when they check out your podcast, The Great Deception Podcast. You had some guests on, you've done several episodes on different topics, some of which we've talked about today. There was something you had in the notes there about Disney. Is there anything you wanted to share about Dark Disney before we wrapped up here today?
Oh no, that was kind of what got me into the game. Was I was known as the Disney guy originally because I had been on Ryan's Dangerous World podcast, and I did a show with the New York Patriot on his podcast about the dark side of Disney, because that kind of got me into this deeper research. And it happened during the pandemic last year that I saw this thread out there that was kind of connecting Disney with, Nazis and with Crowley and all these interesting characters. And I'm like, wow, this is some bullshit. Let me go research this and just show that it's all garbage. And so I started digging into it, and I started finding out, Disney had ties to the CIA. He had ties to the FBI. He has ties to NASA, to Nazis, to Freemasons, to potentially Rosicrucians and all that. So it led to quite an interesting, and I did my first episode of my podcast about it, just to go over to show people, because one of the biggest things nowadays is Disney has become a cult. It has that. There are some people who just follow the Disney way of life, no questions asked. And one of the things you have to look at is anything that becomes that big nowadays, or anyone that becomes that powerful, they have to play ball. And you don't get that big without having some connections or some ties to someone bigger than you. And Disney, I feel, was strictly created as a intelligence / mind control device of the CIA. And the CIA, I mean, they helped them acquire all of their land in Florida to create Disney World. They teamed with them on a bunch of different movies and projects along the way. So it's just one of those where if you look at Disney on the surface, it gives you one thing. When you dig into Disney and some of the messages that it puts out in its programming, and it is programming, you get a whole different view of Disney and that clean, crisp, clean old Uncle Walt kind of fades a little bit, and you see this guy was flawed, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely agree. And the strangest thing is these folks who are so obsessed with Disney, like they wear Disney clothes, they have it in their house, they go there yearly or monthly, even worse, or they go and live there. I mean, geez, it is unlike any other amusement park. It has quite literally a cult following. Wow. Yeah, I've been talking about this book probably way too much. Listeners are like, shut up about Latitude 33 already. But it goes into, this kind of stuff about Disney, but Walter, and he's an ex-FBI agent. So I'm not like, I don't have any illusions about him and possibly him leaving out information or not looking into certain things. It just makes me more suspicious now because he writes that, he doesn't think that Walt Disney was up to anything, and he just was like a regular guy who, did some amazing things and was a prolific businessman. But he connects the point about the carousel to a gentleman who Disney worked with by the name of C.V. Wood, and C.V. Wood was employed by the Stanford Research Institute until Disney approached them about finding a location for Disneyland. And obviously Disney, the way he operated, he, basically sweetheart dealed C.V. Wood, said, come work for me and be my main engineer. And this guy, C.V. Wood, who was very much connected to a lot of those same groups you mentioned before and had some possibly esoteric knowledge, I think Walter puts it that the carousel and the ley line placement that we talked about earlier was all C.V. Wood, not Disney. So that's kind of where Walter takes his approach with this book. But I don't, I thought the book was great, but I don't, totally agree with his assumption or conclusion that Walt Disney was just a stand-up businessman who smoked too much and died young.
Yeah, I mean, the guy he has Club 33, which is basically a Freemason club that they, originally it started in California, and they have it's on the 33rd parallel. It's on, I think it's 33 Royal Street is the name of the address that you can find it at. So yeah, he definitely has some cult ties to him, and he was known to be part of the secret society. So I think there's definitely more to Uncle Walt than people have been led to believe. And I definitely, laid out a pretty good case in my podcast, and you see it in the cartoons. I mean, the themes of dead parents and child abuse and just scaring and torturing children. It's prevalent, and it's over and over again in all of their programming.
Yeah. Yeah, the concept of killing off the mother, and Bambi, Lion King. I mean, pretty much and then you have these strange figures like Cruella de Vil in 101 Dalmatians. These
you get witches, witches, or these the evil stepsisters and things like this, where you have those just nasty adults that are just there to torture children. And it's like, man, this is supposed to be kids programming.
But you put that, up against what was going on in the 1800s with orphan trains and the incubator. I forget what the word is for it, but I know Michelle talks about this, the incubatoriums or something like that.
The infantoriums.
There it is. Yes. And they had them in the incubators. That's where I'm confusing that. But yeah, it is this like strange time in history where, you have the child labor laws and all that stuff. It doesn't fit into what we're told, but I think it is very unsettling when you know what we know now about the child trafficking rings, and maybe they go way back to that time period, and that's why there's all that symbolism. I mean, I forget which author put this out, but they're making a connection between the Goonies and child trafficking. I don't think that's a Disney movie. I think that's Spielberg. But yeah, the Goonies is an interesting kind of child trafficking kind of illusion. But that's why I brought up 101 Dalmatians, because they kind of have that same feel as well. And Pinocchio is
Yep.
another one. Peter Pan. I mean, yeah, they do have that theme throughout the culture of Disney.
Oh yeah, Disney. Yeah, you can take Disney at the face value, but when you dig a little bit into it, you start seeing a whole different side of it, and it's there, and it's done intentionally. You know, whether and people laugh because they're like, oh well, why would they do that? So, because it's part of the agenda. It's part of this. They are shaping cultural means through this stuff. And if everybody thinks everything is just roses and peaceful, you're in for a rude awakening, because there are dark artists out there that are working to program you in a certain direction.
Right. Well, Matt, this has been awesome, man. This has been, a deep dive into many different things, much of which folks can find if they check out your podcast, the Great Deception Podcast, for more info on this and more, because you seem like you're constantly researching things. So I'm sure there's going to be a lot more as time goes on. So I'm looking forward to staying up to date with all that. Tell the listeners what else you got going on. You got a Patreon. You got a way people can support. The holidays are coming up, or maybe by the time this episode's out, it'll probably be about a New Year's time. So, show Matt some love for your New Year's resolution.
Yeah, I got, I'm just planning on keeping the podcast going. Like you said, I'm only about 20 episodes in, 15 episodes in. So I'm just building it up. I don't have any Patreon. I'm not doing any monetization yet. I'm hoping that's one of the steps I'll take next year, because it's not free. I actually pay to put this thing out, not only in time, but monetarily to get all the tools and everything that we need. So yeah. So I think I will eventually get there, but right now, if you just follow my podcast, Great Deception Podcast, or go to my Instagram at the Great Deception Podcast, just leave a review, leave me a rating. I'd appreciate it. I do have a YouTube channel with a couple of videos out there, but they already dinged one of my World's Fairs videos and took that down. So I also have some on BitChute and Odyssey. So same videos, but they probably won't take me down. And I hope going forward to do a little bit more of the video. Like you said, I do a one-man podcast for the most part, and I like to do, deep dives and things like that. But I'd also like to get a lot more interviews this year. Start talking to more people and things like that. And then also I have the Monday Night Master Debaters, which is on every Monday night, get 4 or 5 people together, and we go in with no agenda and just talk about anything that comes up, whether it's current events, whether it's whatever's going on in outside of the news. And that's what I really enjoy, is just connecting with people. I've seen a lot of people make some connections on there where they end up on other people's podcasts. And it's a beautiful thing, man, because I just love seeing people's voices get out there and watching people grow and make nice connections and relationships. And in today's day and age, that's kind of what it's all about.
Indeed. Yeah. And I've been a guest on the Master Debaters, so I definitely encourage folks to check that out. Subscribe to Matt's podcast. The link is in the description. And for those out there listening, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast.
My name's Gabe, aka Whirling Whale, and my family thinks I'm crazy because I think they're so crazy for not believing in the magic of the realm that we live in. This is an amazing reality we've been given. Possibilities are just mind-boggling. Much love, everybody. Peace and strength.
Hey Mark, this is Gordon from the Arizona desert, and my family thinks I'm crazy because they have their illusions intact. The more that we live in authenticity and ask ourselves the hard questions and ask the hard questions of the world around us, we're not afraid to be discerning and intuitive, those layers of illusion start to fall away. Then you end up at this some sort of conspiritual understanding, and the layers never stop. It's an infinity of those illusions, so we have to keep going. I think that's what we're here to do, is ask the hard questions, and I appreciate that about you, brother.
Hi, my name's Ori, and my family thinks I'm crazy because ever since 2002, when I was about 11 years old, from all the movies and Disney movies with villains in it, I remember looking up on the computer to see if anybody's ever taken over the world like the movies back in the day, and that's what brought up the Illuminati and took me down the rabbit hole, and that's why my family thinks I'm crazy.
Thanks for listening to the show, and be sure to sign up for the Telegram and leave us a voice message telling everyone why your family thinks you're crazy. Be sure to tell us your name and also let us know where you're from. Peace. Enjoy this episode. Well, we're here, Ron. We're in the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy extended outro. People have heard you on the show multiple times. So, yeah, we're live. We're here in the extended intro, and you have a spirit animal name. I don't know if you realized it yet, Ron. Did you?
Oh, yeah.
You did. Yes, you learned about your spirit animal name. We're here with the cosmic egg, folks. Not just any cosmic egg, the celestial cosmic egg. Or no, the illuminated egg. The illuminated egg.
The Illuminated Egg. Egg of enlightenment.
I love it. Yes. And we have a new patron that just joined, so I gotta get the deck out, and we'll give him a spirit animal name right here live. Ron, you can see how the magic happens.
All right.
Let's hope this is an exciting one. Some people were disappointed with their spirit animal name, and I had to go back and give them another one. Shout out to you.
They should stick with the one.
Well, yes, that's the new rule. No more no more takebacks or however it goes, but we're giving out these spiritual animal names. And I just want people to know it's just your identity on the Patreon. It doesn't say anything about your actual spirit animal. If it resonates with you in that way, that's a plus, that's a bonus, but just consider this a cool nickname for you to use in the Telegram chat, because some people, they're not as creative as me, and they don't put Mystic Mark at the beginning of their name and use that as their username. So maybe this will be your new username. I saw a username today that was literally creative username 78. So shout out to you. Thank you for joining our Telegram chat. But maybe this person, if they join the Patreon, could have a cool new spirit animal name. So here we go. This is how it happens. That's not the right card. Boom. We got the War Bonnet card, which symbolizes advancement. And we got the Firefly card. So you are newest patron. Let me get their name. Hold on a second. I just had it. Where did it go? Their name is, I just said it before. Thomas. Shout out to you, Thomas. Thank you for joining. You are the War Firefly, or the Firefly of War. Take your pick.
Oh, I like that one.
Right? It's people hear Firefly and they're like, oh man, but when you find out you're the Firefly of War, then it's kind of a badass name. So people shouldn't be so upset if they don't like their spirit animal name, because they're one of a kind, folks. Ron just saw it. It's a unique process. There's 2 decks that go into this. If you want to do it yourself, you're going to have to go out and buy those 2 tarot decks. That's not an easy thing to do. Okay. One of these came from a used bookstore. So good luck with that. All right. The other one is much more easily available. But anyways, Ron, how have you been?
I'm good. Let me give you the take on my spirit animal.
Okay.
My Patreon, my family thinks I'm crazy. Patreon spirit name is the Illuminated Egg, or sometimes you call it the Cosmic Egg. I like the Illuminated Egg, and I'll tell you why.
Tell me.
Inside the egg symbolizes to me the beginning of the rebirth, and it's the Illuminated Egg. So I'm already illuminated because I've been reincarnated from my past life. And the egg represents my new life where I'm coming in more illuminated or more enlightened. And as that egg hatches and I grow and evolve as a person, and if that doesn't happen, well, then you just get put in a frying pan, you get eaten.
Life's tough.
So you got to stay on the right path.
All right. I love it. See, this is a moral to the story that a spirit animal name could help you find. I love that. Thank you, Ron. And maybe the war firefly, the firefly of war, our new friend Thomas, welcome to the family. Maybe he'll have some cool message about his spirit animal name too, or maybe not. But we've gotten a lot of inbox messages. Let's check the pod inbox, Ron. I'm not going to be using the pod inbox anymore. It was a complete and utter waste of money because the whole time I could have been getting voice messages from the Telegram for free. So that was a blunder on my part. No fault of pod inbox. They run a great service. I just do not need their service for $9 a month. It kind of was a big waste of money for 4 months. I think I got like 10 audio messages total from the audience, which is cool. I appreciate everybody who left us a message, but you know, $40-$50 for 10 audio messages when I could have got all of those for free on Telegram is just ridiculous, right? So
You know, Mark, some of these platforms that we're getting involved in a lot heavier, you know, like the Telegram group chat and also on Discord. I mean, these have technologies that we can utilize for free. I mean, and not to sound like a frugal New Englander that I am, and I know that you are. I mean, in this business, we have to be, right? We're not making a ton of money doing this. And in my case, I'm not making any money doing this. But yeah, so when you can get on these different platforms and utilize the tools that they offer, that's great. I mean, like you say, nothing against Pod. What is it? Pod Inbox?
Yep.
Yeah, nothing against them. But I mean, it's like, you know, a lot of these companies, like it's a really great idea when they come out, but the technology evolves so quickly now that, you know, what they had as a great idea that came out as a money-making thing or whatever, you know, within 6 months or a year could actually be totally defunct.
well, and again,
I'm not singling them out. I'm just saying in general.
no, and with technology, you know, there's no patent on the actual method itself. So yeah, they put out a good idea and make some money, but then Telegram goes and says, hey, that'd be cool if people could give voice messages in our chats, and then that solves that problem for me because everybody's already in the Telegram chat anyways. But we did get a cool message from someone that you know as well. Let's hear that message.
Hi, I'm Janet, deplorable Janet. My family thinks I'm crazy because I like to live my life.
Okay, Ron can't hear that one. let me go over to my phone because if I play it on my phone, you'll be able to hear it. But that was Janet for those who did hear it because the recording I think picked that up. But deplorable Janet left us a message, and I just found out recently from a friend that she used to be a co-host on the No Mercy podcast. I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's very
cool. Way back she was. Yeah, I love Janet. She's awesome.
Yeah, she's very nice. I had no idea until just recently that was the case. But you find out all these things. I actually have met Tommy in New Jersey, and he's a very inconspicuous person. People were like, oh, that's Tommy G. And I'm like, okay. I shook his hand. I'm like, hey, what's up? But it's interesting when people are like well known, and then you're like, oh, you're just a regular person. Like Sam actually like has the energy of somebody who's like famous or well known. Whereas some people like Tommy G, they just come off as like a normal dude in person.
Just mellow. I mean, Mark, that's all we really are. We're just normal dudes.
True.
We all have a following. I mean, there's a lot of my listeners that didn't know me from the dangerous world. you know, and I mean, and then I have a lot of listeners like, oh, I heard you first, discovered you on the Dangerous World. So, and not that I was a member of the show, but I was a recurring guest, and Ryan, with Ryan and Brandon, and with Ryan now that Brandon's no longer on the show, which I kind of miss. Actually, I kind of miss Brandon not being on the show, but yeah. So people will recognize you from one show, or picked up a lot of listeners from being on with Joe, Jen, and Ben at Legit Bat. Same thing.
That's just
And
how
being,
this works.
and being on your show. So I mean, I had between all these shows before I started my own, I probably made 50 appearances.
And that's the cool thing about it. It's like we resonate with each other. So I have you on my show, and then it turns out people in the audience resonate with you, so they go check out your show. I hope people do that for Janet's show, The Deplorable Nation. But let's play the clip. Maybe you'll be able to hear it this time.
Hi, I'm Janet, Deplorable Janet. My family thinks I'm crazy because I like to live my life through love and happiness and not focus on the negative or the hate or the bad or the destruction that's going on around me. I choose to bring light and happiness to all situations and teach and heal through love and empowerment and a positive message. And my family does not like that.
Look
Yeah,
at that.
that's awesome.
Now,
That's awesome. You know, wouldn't you agree that we all kind of got to follow Janet's lead on that? Like people need to get rid of the negativity, because I know me, just a little bit of negativity around me, it's like a vampire. It just tries to suck me dry, and I fight it. I have to fight it. I had this conversation with my wife this morning, like every morning she gets up and it's like some dilemma. And I told her this morning, I'm like, you know what? You really got to stop starting your day out with negativity. That's because I absorb your negativity, and I don't like to start my day out with negativity, especially when my coffee is still brewing and I haven't had any yet. Because I'm one of those guys. I got to have my coffee in the morning. Like, have you seen the memes? Like don't, and it shows this frazzled cat. Like, don't talk to me until I've had my coffee.
yeah,
Like, it's me.
I don't know.
100%.
I don't know what I did good, but Tara made me coffee this morning, so I'm very grateful this morning that
Nice.
we got off on a good start, because that happens with me a lot, where I wake up on the wrong side of the bed, so to speak, and yeah, until I, like, I don't know, smoke a little bit and drink a coffee, I usually am on edge. So the worst is when I get right in the car and you know, I don't take a moment to relax, because I used to do that for work. I used to wake up, boom, get dressed, get right in my car, warm it up, you know, and while it's warming up, roll like a blunt up or something, and then, you know, drive off to work. And for some jobs, I would have like a 30-40 minute drive before I even got to the place at like 4 or 5 in the morning. So yeah, now having this job, it's very much a relief, but at the same time, all those same stresses are still here. They're just they just appear in different ways, and it's easier to take those on when you're sitting in your desk at your desk at home, rather than, you know, in a work van in the, you know, 30 below. But, you know,
Yeah.
it is what it is.
Mark, I always said, like, the first 20 minutes or half hour of your day is going to set the mood and set the pace for the whole day.
Right.
So if you start your day out on a negative note, or so, you really have to work hard to fight that, because you don't want it to destroy the rest of your day. Yeah.
That's a good point. I that's why I really liked my bakery delivery job, because I would start the day, you know, sometimes I didn't have enough sleep, but I would start the day productive, and you know, get out of work like at 10 in the morning. And, you know, now I wake up at 10 in the morning. So I used to, like, start my day so early that once I got out of work, I had my whole day ahead of me, and I was very productive in that time period. I will say, I don't know if I'm going to go back to something like that. I might have to if people don't help us out on the Patreon, but it helps when we're part of this community, because, like you said, you've had a lot of folks turn around to your show after being on all these other shows. Same thing has happened to me, especially with, you know, a show like Tinfoil Hat or the Union of the Unwanted, which I'm grateful to be on. But shout out to our friend Joe. He left us a message.
Hey, Mark, this is Joe from Legit Bat Podcast. Just wanted to drop a quick note and say hi, and we love you. Much love from all of us at Legit Bat. See you soon.
Thank you, Joe. To be honest, I asked Joe, I asked everybody to tell us why their family thinks they're crazy, but Joe's family doesn't think he's crazy. Joe's living, pretty solid over there. His wife is on board, his brother's almost on board, and I'm not sure if they have kids or not yet, but I'm sure they'll be on board one day too.
Joe and Jen have kids.
Okay, so yeah. Very cool.
I don't know what the demographic of it is. If it the kids are Joe's or if the kids are Jen's or if there's a combination of both. But yeah, no, they got little ones in the house for sure.
Right on. But
no, they're great people. They're awesome people.
That's the cool thing that I've learned about through this meeting so many interesting people through the podcast is not everybody comes to this sub completely at odds with their family. Like some people, like our friend Rob B, their family's all on board with conspiracies, like it's very interesting to see that, because for my whole life I just assumed that it was so fringe that like only weirdos like me talked about it, and now I find out there's whole families of people that are talking about these things.
Yeah, I think maybe sometimes it's different for different people, whatever your what's the word I'm looking for, whatever your position is in your family.
Sure.
Like in my family, I've, since my dad passed away, I became the patriarch of our family. I'm the oldest son. I do have older sisters and everything. They're not really involved with the family. But so as far as, whether my family thinks I'm crazy, I think they all know that for me to have my position in my family, it means something to be the patriarch in my family. I'm responsible for a lot of things and a lot of people, right? So I'm the go-to guy that when something needs to, when there's a problem, an issue, or we have a tragedy, which we've had in our family, everybody looks to me for the strength, and I'm there for that. So, but I mean, people in my family know that I'm certainly crazy, because you have to be crazy to be the patriarch of this family.
Well, that's a whole nother angle, and this is what I'm talking about. There's so many different angles and walks of life that bring people to this perspective that is still not completely homogenous. There's so many unique perspectives within this community that we're a part of, but we're wrapping up. I mean, this is one of the last days of 2021 here. I don't know. I don't think this episode is going to come out in 2021. It'll probably be out in 2022. But what are your thoughts on this year, Ron? I mean, it's been a wild year. I'm sure we'll get into it in more detail on tonight's show on Legit Bat. But yeah, I feel like there's a real truth to the experience that I know I've heard other people have had this same experience of melding 2020 and 2021 into the same year. Like I even did it in this conversation, not when we were recording, but earlier you mentioned something happening in November, and I'm like, geez, this has gone on for a long time, because it feels like, that's when we met last November. And I'm just like, then I put it together. I'm like, no, he's talking about this past November that was only a month ago, you dummy, For a second, I was thinking of 2020 November, and it's weird how the 2 years have blended together. It really is a new world. I think there's something to that.
Yeah, 2020 and 2021 is all molded together. That's like 1 year. And now looking back, as we're at the end, I mean, today's December 30th, right, while we're recording this. And you look back and it's like so much has happened, but it seems to me, of course, other people might think differently, but the last couple of years have just been a big blur. And I think 2020 was when we were first getting into this whole situation. We were starting to learn. We were slowly learning what was going on. I was starting to get into it. Then I made my first appearance on Dangerous World, which was, I want to say, in June or July of 2020. And then, of course, we've just kind of taken it from there and ran with it. So people that do what we do, that try to get the message out there, and not just that, we talk about other things, but we're paying attention to what's going on out there in the world, and we're getting so much information thrown at us, and we have to process that all, and that takes time. But when you think about everything that's happened in the last 2 years, it's just been really crazy out there. And it's like, now that we're going into 2022, like, I don't think there's going to be a switch that turns that all off. Something that I've been talking about is that the narrative is unraveling. It is slowly unraveling, and I think it's going to come to a point, and we're going to talk more about it on the show tonight, but for going forward for 2022. But yeah, I agree with you 100%. 2020 and 2021, to me, that's 1 year. I mean, that's all blended in, because when we talk about, oh yeah, when this is back in, August or what, okay, was it August of 2020 or August of 2021? Because it's all the same to us, because it's just
Right.
all molded together, and I don't know, people our age, we didn't experience, like World War II and all the craziness that happened back then. And I'm just using that as an example because, the United States has been at a state of war for, 20 years, but it's different than it would have been for people like during World War II. And they think back, okay, there's 5 years, and where did it go? Like, that's how I look at the last couple of years. Where did that time go? Because you think back now, and I have to kind of pay attention, because I ask myself, was that 2020 or was that 2021? And even on the show, I still call it 2020. So, I mean, we just got to get used to that. We're going into 2022, and, we don't know for sure what 2022 is going to bring, but let's hope it brings something better than what we've had. But 2021 was a big year for all of us podcasters, because that's all when we hunkered down, we got busy, and we got out there getting the information out to people. And that's made time fly as well.
Right. Yeah. I mean, speaking for our community, I think a lot of us really came into our own in this past year and found our audiences, and it was a very perfect time for that, because so many people were being pushed to the brink of like, what the hell is going on in this world, that they sought out answers in alternative places, like the places that we provided with our fantastic podcast. I mean, a round of applause for what you've been doing on the Wicked Planet podcast, and the fact that you're on the Glitch in the Code is awesome. I'm really happy to see that. And I feel like my show, every time I talk to people, they always tell me, oh, you put out so many episodes and all that stuff. And I feel like I haven't put out enough, to be honest. And I'm really looking forward to putting something together. I'm inspired by Isaac Weishaupt and this book I bought by him. It's titled Conspiracy Theories and Unpopular Culture, just like his podcast.
Yeah, it's like his show.
Right. It's like 5 or 6, 7 chapters, and each chapter is a somewhat separate topic, but it's a topic that he's covered multiple times on his show. And he takes, whatever research that he put out on the show and compiles it into a neat little chapter. And whether, people buy them or not, I just want to do that. Like, I don't really care whether people like buy the book, but I feel like there are certain subjects and topics that I've been fascinated in that I don't feel like I've seen someone cover. I've seen people cover tangents that come across this subject. I've seen people kind of maybe touch on the subject, but haven't done many. I want to take certain subjects and give my own take, I guess, is all I'm saying. So that's my plan for 2022 is to publish a couple books. I already have one pretty much done, like as far as planned out and written. So we'll see where that goes. But that's a project that I'm doing with Sam. So.
Oh yeah, I'd be interested to see what you have. Like Isaac has a very interesting perspective on a lot of these things, and and I see some people, they really beat up on him, and it's like, I think these people are like not taking the proper perspective on it. Right. But I'd like to get hooked up with him at some point. I'd like to have a little discussion with him, but I like his work. He gets in depth, and I'd be interested to see in that book, Mark. I'll have to check that out. Hey, let me tell you a funny story about books, right? Like in my house, like I'm the conspiracy guy in my house, and everybody, like my wife or whatever, like they don't say that it's a joke, or they'll kind of like give me a little joke about it or whatever, like to give me a hard time. And when our friends get together, we're going to have a bunch of friends over tomorrow night, and I try not to talk about my conspiracy business or whatever you want to call it, or the show, in front of my friends, because a lot of people in my circle of friends that are not in tune to the kind of the things I talk about. But when I was shopping for my niece, because she's a big book reader, and she's also into the conspiracy. She's going to be coming on the show and talking about some SpongeBob and some Simpsons conspiracies. And so I was in there shopping for her, and then of course I walk by and I see, oh, that book looks interesting. Ooh, that book looks interesting. I ended up spending like $60 on books for myself, and then I brought them home, and I gift wrapped them, and I put them under the tree. And my wife's like, what are these? Who are these from? I said, well, they must be from Santa. She goes, these are books. You bought yourself books and you wrap them and you put them under the tree to give to yourself. I said, well, I didn't see you down there buying me any conspiracy books. So anyways, just a little funny story, a little Christmas story.
Well, let us.
So I wrapped up my own books and I gave them to myself for Christmas.
Well, let's share, because I got some books for myself too. I was a good little boy this year, and my mommy gave me a Barnes and Noble gift card, so I didn't buy myself books, but yeah, I definitely, shout out to my mom, I love her. But I got the Occult book by John Michael Greer. It's like it's interesting. Here, I'm gonna grab it and show you, because it's worth showing visual. But while I'm doing that, tell us what books you got. Any titles? Do you remember?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I bought some books that are in tune to kind of like some of the shows that I want to cover, some of the subjects I'm going to be covering. So I bought one book. It was Psychopaths and Murderers, and it gives in-depth analysis to the people, the serial killers or whatever. So I call that my psychopath serial killer book that I bought. I bought a book on Jack the Ripper, which it gives accounts of some of the witnesses and some of the people that lived in the Victorian times during the time of Jack the Ripper, and kind of their take on, what they perceived when they were, seeing this happen or not watching it on the news, but, reading about it in the newspaper. And that kind of covers a series that we're going to be doing coming up. So I bought that for research than anything, because I have a really cool series coming up that I'm not going to talk about, but it has to do with serial killers. Some of us guys in our podcasting community, which I just want to say, shout out to All Media United. Our podcast community has grown huge in the last year. So kudos to you for that. So I bought a book on psychic detectives, which I think is going to be super interesting. It's going to go back to Looking Glass and some of the not MK Ultra, but what was remote viewing. The remote viewing, and then also how some police forces and detectives use psychics to help solve murders and other crimes. So I think that's going to be real interesting. And I bought some. I bought a book like the diary, not the diary, but the Encyclopedia of Conspiracy Theories. So these are all just kind of research books for me, but I'm really looking forward to going through them. And they're not books like that you have to read from front to back. You could just kind of cherry pick out the stories that you want to read and talk about. Right. But because we're going to be getting into some deeper subjects going forward with the show, so I have to do my homework to make that happen. I like my listeners to be happy, and also to gain more listeners. And my listeners respond really well to the strange stuff. So that's kind of the goal for 2022 for me and the show, The Wicked Planet.
Yeah. I had Chaz of the Dead on the show. We got into some really strange stuff that I know I'm pretty sure you've spoken with Chaz before.
Oh yeah. And times gonna have him on the show. I've read that book, by the way.
Isn't this a great book? I love it.
Yeah, it's very cool.
I'm
gonna read it again.
What's cool about it for me personally is I've been reading this book, Empire of the Wheel by Walter Bosley, and Walter talks a lot about these breakaway civilizations, which when I read, and I haven't finished it yet, but when I started reading Chaz's book, I'm like, oh, these friendship people sound just like a breakaway civilization, maybe minus.
It's exactly what they are.
Right. So don't spoil it, because I think I'm on chapter 8 of Chaz's book. And I'm like halfway through this book. If you could see, I'm exactly halfway through this 500-page book. So I'm rocking it. I don't know what got into me in the past month, but I've been reading a lot of books.
Where's the book that your mom got you, the occult book?
Oh, so she didn't buy it. She got me a gift card. All right.
Oh, okay.
Because she wouldn't know which books to get. So
I got you. She paid for it, so she bought it.
She paid for it. So I got this book, by John Michael Greer. Very cool book.
That is
And
cool.
the reason why I got it, to be honest, was because when we showed up at Barnes & Noble, they were having a 50% off sale on hardcovers only, every hardcover in the store, which was cool because hardcovers are more expensive. But I also like noticed in that moment that not a lot of the books I was interested in were hardcover, unfortunately. So I had to kind of like dig around and find this book, which I was happy to find because I like John Michael Greer. And this book is not your traditional history of the occult. I mean, he touches on a lot of different, I mean, here, I'll just show you kind of like.
Oh, it has a lot of graphics in it too. I like that.
Yeah, each page is, or each, every time you flip a page, it's an image and a paragraph, or text. So
that's cool.
So yeah,
cool.
it's very visual, and they touch on a couple interesting things that I haven't seen in other books, which is always a good indicator. Then I got this book, which is translated by John Michael Greer. It's one of the better translations of this book by Eliphas Levi, who he's come up a couple times in recent conversations on the podcast. So I'm like, I should have this book.
He's a Frenchman, correct?
Yeah, Eliphas Levi was a big inspiration for Aleister Crowley, actually. And then Tara, who you're familiar with, my lovely girlfriend, got me some books from the used bookstore, I imagine. I don't know. Yeah, it was a used bookstore because she gave me the receipt.
Great place to find odd books.
Indeed. Check these out.
Yeah.
So she got Cahokia, City of the Sun. Very interesting. Got another one that I don't know where it went. I think she has it in her area of the room because I can't find it over here. But then Michelangelo, which doesn't have a cover, but it's interesting. And then Leonardo da Vinci, a book about all of his human body. It's a big, heavy book, a book all about his sketches.
Yeah, okay, so I have a huge book on Da Vinci. I am fascinated with Da Vinci, and I'd actually like to do a series of shows about him as well.
I'm interested in the parts about the heart particularly, which is funny. I just opened to that because I don't remember what podcast I was listening to. It might have been Mysterious Universe, but they were talking about how the heart does not function the way we're told in science. It's not a pump, it's happening. What's happening is like an electromagnetic, possibly zero gravity. Like, there are keys to alternative energy, according to this one source that I can't remember who I was listening to. But if it was Mysterious Universe, then they were just talking about an author. So that's probably more likely. I don't know. It's not that important. But the point is the heart might reveal secrets about alternative energy sources. Have you heard anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Our bodies carry, I forget how many amps or how many volts of electricity. So we are electric beings. And that's why I like, not to get off topic, but when you talk about the electric field, the electric universe, and how that interplays with water, and how your water should be live water when you drink it because your body needs that. That all has to do with the electricity that's within our body, and how the heart is actually the big player in that. It's not your brain. It's not just your brain. It's your heart.
Right.
And that's why they say you died of a broken heart. Well, that's true because that all comes from your heart. Right? It translates from your heart to your brain instead of the other way around. That's just my theory on it. Hey, I just wanted to say something. Like, I think the listeners, they need to understand, or they don't have to understand, but how much work we put into just doing the research. Look at the books you have. You should see, I don't know if you can see back in my bookcases behind me, but I have, books and books and books and books, and everybody will come in and they'll say, oh, do you read all those books? Yeah, I read all those books. Yeah, where do you think all this stuff comes out of this brain? You have an idea, and then you go and you find a book that's about that subject, and that's where used bookstores come in real handy. It is actually a lot of used book outlets online that you can find too, that you can find books that they're just not out. They're out of print. But we spend a lot of time reading, like in between doing our real jobs and helping with our family and doing our chores. Like we try to find that little bit of time when we can get absorbed into a subject and read a book. And books are fascinating. Everybody said books are dead. Books are not dead as far as I'm concerned. Maybe for the regular Joe, they're dead. but more people need to get back into the actual art of reading a book. To learn more about life than other than, let's watch a 20-minute segment on YouTube and now I'm an expert in the field. Not the case. You can spend literally years learning about a subject like me and the Nazis. Like I was thinking about this the other day. Like we talk about so many different subjects in so many different genres. I said what I really think I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate with my one genre being the history of the Nazis, the history of their mindset, which also goes with the little octopus tentacles off into occultism, off into the banking system, off into the New World Order, the World Economic Forum, the Great Reset. This is all based on Nazi principles. And this is why I would like to stay in that genre and learn more. Like, I think I know a lot about the Nazis now, and then I start reading more. I don't know as much as I think I do. And I'm not afraid to admit that. So I need to learn more and more and more. Hey, since you're sharing books, let me show you one that I keep right here. I found it a long time ago. Let me hold on. I got to reach over and grab it.
Ron, why aren't you sitting at that much nicer, bigger desk behind you? That desk is beautiful.
Because I have my computer set up on my little desk. That's the desk I sit at when I have to.
When you have important meetings.
When I have to fix problems.
So,
do you see that?
Yes. Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Hitler suppressed and still secret weapons, science, and technology. This book is amazing. And I don't even know if you can even find this book anymore. But this is just like so much stuff on German technology and Nazi technology.
That's a lot of what Walter's touching on, not quite yet at the part I'm in the book, but from what I've gathered from listening to his interview, it seems like the Germans were a big part of this airship breakaway civilization that he's discussing. I think I brought this up on a show we were on earlier, I don't know, or maybe just on a phone call with you, but the idea that Walter proposed that, like, in the same trajectory that we see the Model T evolve into a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, you can take that same technological evolution and apply it to the airships of the 1850s to the Roswell flying saucers of the 1950s. It's the same time, 100 years, and look at how much progress we see with cars over that 100-year period. Why wouldn't it be true for airships, right?
Yeah, no, it's exactly true. And again, it all goes back to what we talked about earlier. Everything evolves so quickly now. And even though it is evolving, I think it's just repurposed old technology that was there to begin with.
Right.
Yeah. Hey, I mess with cars. Like, that's what I do for a living, right? So I've seen the difference in cars since I started working on cars back in the 60s when I was a kid. Cars and motorcycles and dirt bikes and snowmobiles and all that stuff, right? I just recently bought myself a car. I don't spend a lot of money on myself for cars, but I had an opportunity to buy a car that I really wanted. I've always really wanted one. I found one. It's a little beat up, but I can fix that. And this car has zero technology in it. This car was made by General Motors. It's and I'll tell everybody what it is. It's a 96 Impala SS. It's a great big sedan that's built on the police pursuit car chassis. It has the LT1 V8 motor in it, which is a no frills motor. It's a push rod motor. It is fuel injection, but it was made to go fast. That was its only purpose. And this car has power windows. It has a CD player, has air conditioning, stuff like that, but it has no electronics. It has none of that. Now you take that car and you go up to my recent car, which was a Cadillac, and that had all kinds of technology in it, right? But then you get into my truck that my wife drives, or I should say our truck or her truck. That thing's like sitting in an airship or like sitting in the cockpit of a 747. There's so much going on. You got touch screens. You got screen coming up in front of you. You got all these switches and toggles everywhere that does all kinds. The whole roof opens up. I mean, just the evolution in cars in the last 20 years has been totally, like, not even 20 years, has been totally insane. So who's to say that air flying technology couldn't change over 100 years?
Right.
I mean, we know about dirigibles. You know, when you're talking about airships, you're talking dirigibles. We're talking hot air balloons. Dirigibles, for people that don't know, that's like what the Hindenburg was a dirigible, right? So yeah, I think air travel was around a lot longer. You know, they say that the Montgolfier brothers from France is who invented the hot air balloon. You know, is that true? Yeah, that probably is true. But look at how far that's evolved. I mean, hot air balloon technology is about the same now as it was, 100 years ago. But I mean, who's to say that there wasn't some type of advanced airships like before that?
Well, and there's stories, I don't know how fantastical this is, but because I don't remember the source, but there are stories I remember reading. I think it's from like the Mongols, what they talked about the Mongols having basically hot air balloons that they made from elephant skins. I don't know if that's where that comes from. So maybe that's not a real source, but so I
Would
think
would that surprise you though? Because
no.
the Mongols and the Huns, Attila the Hun, like their armies were massive, and they had technology.
Yeah.
Even the early Islamic armies like Salahuddin, his technology and his weaponry and things like that. They had the towers with the catapults on them,
Right.
and things like. I mean, that was advanced technology for that day.
Right.
And I mean, these are just kind of people sitting back and coming up with these ideas, or was this ideas that they discovered, like from some ancient history, even going back 2,000 years, right? Because you're talking early Christianity, in those times, or even before Christianity, when the Huns and the Mongols and those warring tribes were around, they had technology. And this is why they were so strong and so big. Same thing goes with the Romans. The whole way that the Romans designed to fight, they still teach that shit at West Point, right? Today, like they still teach that stuff.
Right.
So
Yeah. I remember.
Old technology, Mark. Old technology is just old technology. But new technology is also old technology.
Yeah, no, you can't reinvent the wheel. You can only repurpose it.
Right.
Yeah. I love it, man. I think there's so much stuff I've been getting into lately, and I've been talking so much about this one author in particular that I'm excited to say now I'm gonna have him on the show soon. I haven't reached out to him yet, but I have his email, so fingers crossed we'll get him on the show. He seems like he's open to doing a bunch of shows, so it shouldn't be a problem. But yeah, I'm excited to talk to Walter. Unfortunately, we got to reschedule with Gareth. Still no response from him. I emailed him around 11 and said, "Hey, gonna reschedule or what? What's going on here?" So we'll see what happens. But it's fun talking to you as usual.
They're really busy guys over there, Mark. Something probably came up.
No big deal.
But yeah, you'll get him back on the show, and I definitely want to be part of that when you have him on the show.
Yeah, will do. Thanks for joining me. Kind of meandered all over the place, but I want to give you an opportunity to tell the listeners where they can find you in 2022. Like you said, Alt Media United, you're a part of that crew. So let the listeners know where they can find your show.
Well, we're on the Wicked Planet podcasts on all your major podcast platforms, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcast, Castros. I mean, Podbean. We could just go on and on and on. It's on, and that's thanks to you, Mark. And we're thinking, if we move from Anchor, we might be going to something different to get us out there to a broader audience. But Spotify is really good. I want to say 55% of our listenership listens to us on Spotify. So that's where you can find us. Just look us up, the Wicked Planet Podcast. Please hit the follow and subscribe button. Turn on your notifications so when the new episode comes out, which generally is going to be either a Wednesday late or a Thursday, is when our shows come out. But going into 2022, we're going to be probably doing a fair amount of one-on-one shows with a lot of guests, and I've been asked to be a guest on a lot of very, very good podcasts. Looking forward to doing that. And as always, great conversation with you, Mark. Thanks for inviting me on for a little chat here. Our show didn't go as planned today, but that's okay. We'll these things happen in the podcasting world, but that's okay. We give everybody a little bit of something to listen to, and we're going to all be getting together tonight. So I'll be seeing you a little bit later.
Right
so people
on.
need to people need to keep an eye on Legit Bat for when that episode's going to be coming out.
Oh yeah, that'll be out by the time this comes out. And that's the cool thing about doing these extended outros now, is that when something like this happens or we have an opportunity to talk, jump on the show, and it's a little bit more informal. And
there was one other thing, Mark.
Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. Come and follow me on Instagram, Ron from New England, and the Wicked Planet Podcast. 2 different pages. I kind of do the same thing on both, but just come and give me a follow. I'd like try to get those numbers up a little bit too. And if you follow me on Instagram, you'll get a heads up on when the new episodes are out and kind of a base of what that's going to be on. And I also give a heads up on when I'm going to be on another show as well. So you can kind of follow me what's going on. Feel free to DM me. I answer all my DMs. It might take me a day or two to do that. And also my listeners or your listeners, if they have any questions, they can just email me at the Wicked Planet Podcast at gmail.com. Send me what you got. I try to respond to anything and everything.
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you for joining us here, Ron, and thank you for listening, folks out there. Hope you enjoyed this wonderful conversation with Matt from the Great Deception Podcast, and of course, this one with my friend Ron from the Wicked Planet Podcast. Enjoy the moment wherever you are in the ever-expanding now.